You also have, you have two Lisa Porschers.
Well, that's interesting. Well, one of them is
David Pollock. They just
David
changed his
Powell.
name.
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to start. Welcome to the Advisory Committee meeting of Monday, November 19, 2025. At least for the beginning of the meeting, I, Harry Friedman, will be chairing, and we're hoping that Dennis Dowdy arrives around 7:30 or so. He is on an aeroplane. Um, so let me share the agenda if I can.
Harry,
Yeah,
I think you said November 19th, but I know you meant May 19th.
you are correct. I did mean May 19.
But for the recording, we might want to correct that.
Yes, it is the 19th of May, 2025.
I think he was referring to when this meeting is going to end.
Yes, I think so.
Oh, um, there. So the agendas. 7 o'clock public comment. If you're a member of the public and you're interested in commenting on any of the things we're doing tonight, put your name in the chat and David and Mark will call on you. Otherwise, the chat, at least chat to everyone, is restricted to advisory committee members. We will be voting on several budget amendments. Melissa will be presenting 3 of them, and then Alec Lebovitz will be presenting the 4th. And when we finish those, we will go to a discussion of warrant articles 14 and 15. So let's stop sharing. Let's open up participants, open up the chat. And I will give an apology in ahead of time. My computer is doing strange and horrible things tonight, so it may not work well for me. David, Mark, anybody in the chat?
No, no. And your picture is freezing a little bit. You might want to turn off the video.
I think that's a good idea. Okay.
Do have some more people coming into the meeting.
I'm not seeing anybody.
Okay, and Richard Benka put in a message in the chat, assuming he's going to hold off on comments until you get to 14. Do you want to take him first?
No, I will. He will be commenting when we get to 14.
Okay.
He's a petitioner. So seeing nobody else, Melissa, could you start us off on the 3, what I'm assuming are relatively small budget changes that we can do all at once?
Yes. So in your packet, you should have a series of memos from me kind of describing where we have left off since you last voted on the budget. One of the things that was still outstanding at the time that we took our vote was for me to reconcile the group health savings that the schools were capturing from all their staffing changes. I've since gone through and validated everything that Susan has sent me and had the select board vote those changes at their meeting last Tuesday. After that, there was still an issue of the school food services revolving fund and how that was going to work next year. Susan and I had a conversation this morning. So there is a memo talking about the food services transfer to support the benefits associated with that program. And that is actually going to be split 200,000, at least the recommendation is 200,000 to the school appropriation, $100,000 to the police department appropriation. As we've been working through the police department budget, Charlie's done a phenomenal job with Liz Scott. We're recognizing that there's still a lot of pressure on that budget, especially around some of their contractual services. So we felt that that was an appropriate place to put the additional capacity coming from this adjustment. So those are the two adjustments that affect the budget table, and you should have in your packet the budget tables that, if you take this vote, will kind of clean up into a clean motion for town meeting to consider. But at the end of the day, the overall appropriation would be 408,522,486. That's for appropriated expenses. And when you add the additional non-appropriated, your total all-in budget is 419,173,349. So those are the changes impacting the budget table. And then one last change is around the conditions of appropriation. And thanks to Charlie Homer and his watchful eye around public health, he recognized that we did not include the newly created health department vaccine revolving fund. We need to set an annual cap on spending for that. So that is $30,000 of spending authority for that program. It will be added to the language under revolving funds, which is section 8 in your budget vote. So those are the three changes that we're looking for you to adopt this evening.
Thank you. And when we get to a vote, I'm going to ask you to give me something that I can write in the vote tally that will make some kind of sense. David, Mark, any questions or comments?
We have a lot of people, they just haven't signed up yet.
Well, then the early bird gets the worm. Melissa, can you give me a motion? And then I will ask someone to move that.
So I think it probably would make sense just to reference the memos that I've written to both the board and the advisory committee. So favorable action on the amendments to the advisory committee's budget vote as described in the deputy town administrator's memos of May 13th and May 19th.
So favorable action on amendments in deputy town administrator's memoranda of May 13?
13 and 19. So there are 3 memos, one written on the 13th, 2 memos written today.
19, 2025. Will somebody please move that?
So moved.
Will somebody second that?
Seconded.
Great. Let me share the screen. See if this works. Can people see that?
Yes.
Okay. No?
My screen is currently blank.
I can see it.
Okay.
But
I can see,
only-
I can see it too. Yep.
I can
I
see
can
the
see it.
top
You
of
can see
it.
it also.
Hmm.
Okay.
All we can see is the vote language, basically, and the top of the,
Just
Well-
so you know, Dennis is coming in now.
And this is coming in now, but we will persevere. Michael Berger, he's not here yet, is he?
I don't believe
I don't
so.
believe so. Ben Birnbaum,
Yes.
yes. Harry Boers is not here. Cliff Brown,
Yes.
yes. Anthony Buono,
Yes.
yes. John Doggett,
Yes, yes.
Catherine Florio,
Yes.
yes. I'm present. David Mark Goldstein,
Yes,
Neil Gordon, Neil?
Yes.
Yes.
Said yes.
He said yes.
Okay. Susan Granoff?
Yes.
Yes. Perry Grossman?
He's
Uh,
here. He's here, just not unmuted.
Perry, can you hear us?
Said yes. Can you
Yes, thank you. Kelly Hardeback?
Yes.
Yes. Elisa Jonas?
Yes.
Yes. Janice Kahn?
Yes.
Alec Lebovitz?
He's,
Alec? Carol Levin?
Yes.
Pam
Alec
is-
appeared to say yes.
Okay.
He's nodding.
Yep. Great. Pam Lodish, not here, I believe. Jocelyn Murphy?
Yes.
Danelle O'Neill?
Yes.
Linda Olson Pelkey?
Yes.
Marcus Penzel?
Yes.
Fran Perler?
Yes.
What's going on here?
I'm here, David Pollock, yes, but somebody needs to rename me.
Okay, we will take care of that. Lee Selwyn
Yes.
and Chris Westfall
Yes.
and Dennis Dowdy.
Abstain.
Staying.
And Mark, can you change David's name?
I don't have the ability as a co-host to do that. Only the host can do that.
Okay.
Actually, I think the co-host can, but
I
let me
tried
get,
earlier. and I didn't-
let me get to it in a minute. By a vote of 22 to 0, we have approved these budget amendments. Let me stop sharing for the moment. And so there, as of this afternoon, there were two more budget amendments. One by Bob Miller regarding the school committee, and that has been withdrawn. Bob is not moving that. So we have one from Alec Lebovitz. This is an issue with which everyone on advisory is familiar. This is regarding the sanitation budget. So Alec, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Harry. Can everybody hear me? I was having some microphone issues. Okay, great. It might be beneficial if I could share my screen, Harry, if you could enable that.
Sure. Let me make you a co-host. Okay, go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. All right, well, good evening, everyone. As Harry mentioned, this is an issue that we've discussed at some length, but myself, along with my co-petitioners, Jocelyn Murphy, Anthony Buono, Danelle O'Neill, Richard Murphy, and David Mark Goldstein, are offering the following amendment to Warrant Article 9 that would effectuate essentially what the advisory committee previously considered at our second hearing on the DPW FY26 budget. And that is the restoration of in-house solid waste collection services within the sanitation division for fiscal year 2026 in order to provide an opportunity to pause on the decision for privatization of these services and the opportunity to implement personnel-facing reforms within the sanitation division to try and reverse the difficulties of the last few years in retention and recruitment for that workforce. The motion itself maintains the proposed total FY26 budget for the DPW, but does move some monies between divisions, which you can see here in the Table 1 amendments. Specifically, 118,000 and change would be moved from the proposed sanitation division budget to the highway division, and that represents the restoration of 2 FTEs in the highway division that are currently slated to be phased out to partially fund the proposed 5-year Casella contract. Additionally, we propose to move monies within object classes for the sanitation's budget, or sanitation division budget, predominantly moving money from the purchase of services line item to the personnel services line item reflecting the restoration of 7 FTEs within the sanitation division for FY26. There is also an increase to the capital outlay line item for sanitation, reflecting the restoration of what would have been regular maintenance investments in the town's trash collection vehicle fleet. I would point folks to the beginning of the petitioner's explanation. You can see here we have a bulleted list that provides the actual shifting of each monies between object classes. And again, just reiterates that this would maintain the total funding level for FY26 for DPW. It would maintain the balance of the overall town budget. And again, would provide the opportunity for meaningful reforms to be trialed in FY26 to prove the long-term viability of maintaining solid waste collection within the DPW, which we feel in the long run would provide significant savings on operating costs and also allow us to provide quality service on a lower cost basis in general. So I think I'll leave it there in terms of the overview. Happy to field any questions and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Let's go to questions and comments.
Harry, are you taking over questions now that Dennis is here? Or do you want me to?
Yes, I will take over questions, and Dennis, you go ahead.
I will happily drive. The only thing that I would say here is I actually want to have one question up front. Alec, you said this is substantially what we voted before. It strikes me as virtually identical, if not identical. Is there any way in which it is substantively different from what we already discussed?
The numbers are the same. So I don't know if that means, we take another vote separately or we apply the vote that was taken previously. But
I think we would take a vote because this is an actual amendment being proposed for town meeting. But I wanted that to guide our discussion tonight, that this is exactly what we spent many hours debating previously and have a prior vote on. So I would hope that this particular conversation is going to likely be informed by that. So go ahead, Harry.
Marcus Penzel.
So the money that's allocated for the hiring of 7 new FTEs, why do you who are moving the amendment think that the town will have any more success hiring into those positions than they have had, or lack of success that they've had in the past? And if those folks are not hired in relatively soon, but scattered along the whole fiscal year, how is that going to give any indication of how this program would work?
Yeah, it's a great question, Marcus. And, I think our overriding concern in approaching this decision is that once it is made, it will be prohibitively expensive and logistically difficult to unmake it. In terms of the recruitment, and I see some of my co-petitioners, it looks like, want to respond to this as well, so I'll try and be brief. My understanding is that there have been recent applications from prospective workers for sanitation, including the expression of interest. I don't think the actual completion of an application, but we've spoken to a number of former sanitation workers who had expressed interest in potentially returning to sanitation with the return of early quits. Some of these workers still hold other positions in the town in different divisions. So, we've seen some promise that if there were a concerted effort made that I think garnered the support and buy-in of the existing workforce, both in sanitation and in other surrounding divisions, of the return of early quits, then there would be a real prospect to reverse some of the retention and maintenance issues with the workforce. So I'll leave it there at the high level, and I'll turn it over to, I see Jocelyn Murphy and Anthony Bono want to add something.
Anthony, you have a 2-finger. I'll give it to you first.
Thank you. Yeah, Mark. So the way that I would answer your question is fairly simple. When we were dealing with the early quit pilot program that lasted for about 2.5 months, it's really important to remember that during that time frame, they were not looking for outside applicants. They were only looking at hiring internally during that time frame. So we have not had a base case of understanding what is the retention that could be possible from bringing back early quits since 2019, I believe, when early quits were originally eliminated. The pilot program, again, lasted 2.5 months and was not open to the public, only internally. And it takes 5 weeks to onboard somebody into the sanitation department. So that's how I would answer your question.
Marcus, are you all set?
Yeah, I'm set.
Thank you. Janice Kahn.
Thank you, Harry, and thanks for your answer. And Marcus, this is sort of following up what you're saying. So, and to Dennis as well. So to me, this feels different than what we voted on before. Last time it was really clear, it was all like a 1-year pause trial. But the way it's written now, and I want to thank the group that's brought this to us again, but in this form, what it says to me is that it's restoring a departmental budget. It doesn't say that it's not going to be in fiscal year 27 or in future years. What it's doing is saying that we're funding a budget that we have funded in the past, and so it sort of normalizes the process. I think really at this point, we have to either decide that we're going to commit to having this in-house, or we're going to privatize. And to me, this is saying, okay, if we support this amendment, what we're saying is this is staying in Brookline and we're going to keep it as an in-house one, that it's not a 1-year trial. Honestly, I don't think I could support a 1-year trial, because to me, that sets it up for failure. You know, you need to be committed to making it work. And I think a 1-year trial doesn't, to me, set that bar of commitment. You know, what that says to me is just, well, we get through 12 months and then we go to privatizing. And that's not, I think, what the goal of this group that's brought the amendment forward is really seeking. So since you're the lead petitioner, Alec, so I just want to get your sense, is this how you see it, that it's no longer a 1-year trial, which I would not support, but that you're seeing it as a restoration, you know, is keeping this division whole and operational within Brookline now and for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Janice. I mean, to be perfectly clear, the budget impact of this amendment is identical to what was voted on previously by this committee. I will say I agree with your sentiments pretty much completely that this could take more than 1 year. This will require buy-in from all the stakeholders at play. And it does fundamentally come down to what our vision of the best service model for solid waste collection is. Having, as a member of the ad hoc subcommittee, reviewed the policies at work in depth, as well as our projections for at least the first 5-year contract, there's no question that privatization will lead to a higher cost basis. Yes. It very well might lead to annual cost increases above inflation and potentially above what would otherwise be realized by in-house service collection. And no party is stipulating that this is a cost-saving measure.
Right.
So from our perspective, we have a decision point in front of us this evening and at town meeting later this month, which is, do we want to commit to permanently privatizing this service, which I believe the FY26 budget proposal under Warrant Article 9 would lead to, or do we want to consider at least a 1-year moratorium on that decision? That could certainly be extended, but we can't bind future town meetings. We can't commit to extending this service longer than FY26 because that's not in our authority to do. So I would say, in terms of the motion in front of you, this only guarantees fiscal year 26 to trial these, the return of early quits, these other performance or recruitment based stipends that we're recommending as policy initiatives. But I think this is what will allow us more time to make this decision with more data down the road, and to really make a concerted effort to address the retention and workforce maintenance issues that are at hand. So, we can't, again, unfortunately, commit to future town meetings, but that's, I think, how I'd answer your question.
So, Alec, I mean, I would kind of disagree. I mean, we fund every budget for 1 year. So, you know, I take your point, but again, I really want, I really want some assurance that this is not just a 1-year pause and then we go to privatization. I totally agree with you. Privatization is going to lead to higher costs and and costs we can't control essentially for the future. So, so I'd also like to understand what the administration's, you know, it needs leadership support, I think, to make this work. And I would find it hard to support a 1 year without that kind of assurance. So, thank you.
Thank you. Danelle, you had a two finger?
Yeah, thank you. This goes to Janice's point, and to what Marcus mentioned. So the employees, the people who are actually throwing the trash, and Janice, you've been to quite a few of these meetings, have stated that they want to do the trash. They want to throw the trash. And the administration, the people who are not doing the work are saying, no, we're going to privatize. So what we've been hearing from the employees, point blank, is that they want to still throw the trash. And that's what it comes, that's where what I'm getting from this. We're not changing the money in the budget. It's being funded, like you said, we do it every year for every department. But the employees aren't actually being heard. And so because this deal has already been made for the select board and whoever, we already know what the administration stated. So they want to move forward or try to make this privatized already. You know, I don't know the last time a select board member has done a Bobby Allen, reached out to sanitation workers at the DPW or visited to see how they're feeling about this. But what we've heard on record is the employees stating that they want to still throw the trash. And I'm hoping it's not going to be just a one year thing. So if we get the employees to fill the positions, that proves that we should not lose this infrastructure that we have, this nugget that we have in sanitation department. Because when we lose it, we lose it. It's gone. So that's why I'm really supporting this amendment and going forward. Who actually throw the trash have stated they want this, and they haven't been heard. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Jocelyn Murphy?
Thanks very much, Harry. So with my usual disclosure, that I at one time had a family member who's a member of the, who is an employee of the Highway and Sanitation Division. In response to Janice's question, you know, I think the 1 year, that 1 year proposal was intended early on to be sort of a compromise to those who kept hearing the repeated, this is our only choice. Because of course there has to be relief at the end of the road. The trash does have to be picked up and there needs to be relief. So it was somewhat of a compromise, but I don't think certainly speaking for myself, I believe that sanitation should stay in-house because I know that it can. I've spoken to several of the fellows who work in sanitation and highway, and they really like the job. What they like about the job is that they can go to work, they can finish they essentially have autonomy because they work up at the transfer station. So they come and go from there, they do their work. And frankly, they're not paid very much. So they have second jobs. And so, you know, I've watched all of the meetings pertaining to this starting in January. I watched the October meeting as well, but the January meeting when this was first essentially raised as a contract. And the select board was told that there's no choice. The Solid Waste Advisory Committee was told there's no choice. This committee was told there was no choice because the workers left, and we know why they left. They left because at the height of COVID, it was actually 2021. At the height of COVID, their most precious benefit was taken away from them. And they needed that benefit because they have second jobs, because that's the only way they can make ends meet. But they liked their job. And so when that was taken away unilaterally, by the way, with nothing in exchange, there was no collective bargaining, there was no return for that benefit, which had been in place for decades. Naturally, several of them left because they couldn't make ends meet otherwise. So they immediately left. The fellows that have hung on for a number of reasons, and I think largely because they like their job. And so there is a choice, and the choice is to acknowledge and respect and pay competitive stipends, whatever they may be, whether it's a restoration of early quits and a stipend, which is what every other community does, including Cambridge, our neighbors in Cambridge. The sanitation workers have early quits and they have a stipend because of the nature of their work. And it's very common in collective bargaining that members within a single bargaining unit who do specialty work have different benefits, and it's because of the nature of their work. That's not too difficult to understand, and it happens everywhere in every collective bargaining unit that I'm familiar with. I also wanted to add that Boston is currently on a 1-year extension of their contract with Capital Waste. They had a 3-year contract with 2 1-year extensions, which frankly is a far better model than a 5-year contract. And last year, or a year and a half ago, the city decided they weren't happy with their model. And so they set out to do a review, as we had suggested early on, to review what would work best for the city of Boston with a plan to change their model. And they ran out of time. So they're currently operating under a 1-year extension. I think it would be a huge mistake to accept this contract. And I don't want to criticize the Commissioner of Public Works. You know, she has a large department to run. But if you look closely at the facts of this matter, frankly, it's a management issue, right? The early quits was taken away, and it caused a cascade of feelings and emotions among the fellows who work in sanitation, causing some of them to leave. And the department hasn't been able to recover. So they've been all of the things that were described to you, such as filling sanitation positions with highway workers, has had to take place so the trash can be picked up. And no one's happy about it. I feel certain that the town can return to the model that was in place before. And by the way, I would point out, in South Brookline, I have not had any trouble with my trash pickup. I know that it has been represented that the service is failing. It may be failing, but it's limping along, and there's no reason why it can't limp along for a little bit longer. You know, and there's no doubt in my mind the trash will be picked up, because this is Brookline, and Commissioner Shute is going to ensure that that happens. So I truly believe it would be a really massive mistake to switch over to privatization. We know it's going to cost somewhere in the range of, I believe it's $200,000 more in year 1, and that escalates to over $1 million in year 5. And then there's no going back. And so I ask you to think long and hard about whether this is really a good idea. I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Linda Olson-Pelkey.
Thanks, Harry. I may be being dense here, but if we're simply changing the budget numbers, what is the assurance that the DPW will not simply plow ahead with the contract and move money around and not respond to the goal of these budget amendments? I mean, I know before we were talking about that town meeting has the authority to fund or not fund the contract, but I don't see that happening within this amendment. So what am I missing? What is going to kind of be the glue that sticks this all together and gets the DPW to respond to these changes in the way that the petitioners want?
I'm happy to speak to that, if that's okay, Harry and Dennis.
Go ahead.
Thanks. And it's a great question, Linda. If you look on the first page of our motion, you'll see under the Table 1 and Table 2 amendments, a section heading titled Transfers Among Appropriations. And part of the motion that we've offered here would add a new section B to warrant article, that part of warrant article 9, that clarifies that any transfers within the DPW sanitation division to other object classifications or purposes will only be permitted with the prior approval of the select board and the advisory committee. So should this amendment pass town meeting, we would be comfortable that the oversight from the select board and advisory committee together would be sufficient to ensure that the will of town meeting was followed. I think
are you set, Linda?
No. I'm not familiar with the terminology of object classes, but I guess that means something to Melissa, so that's okay.
I believe in this case, we would kind of interchangeably use that within with the term line items within a division. Correct me if I'm wrong. So.
So essentially, Linda, what they are proposing is to make it so that if the DPW wanted to move money back into services to fund the contract, they would only be able to do that if the AC was on board with that as well.
And the select board.
Correct.
Right.
Well, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Going once, going twice, going thrice? Dennis, we're ready for a motion.
All right, so there should.
No, we're not ready for a motion. Janice?
I do have one more question. So what happens to our recycling contract? Because they were bundled. So the contract that the select board signed actually has both recycling and trash. So if we do not approve what is before, what was presented, what actually do we still have, and do we even have a contract left for recycling?
Yeah, that's a great question, Janice. So the reduction in the purchase of services object class for the sanitation division only removes the additional funding that would be required to fund the solid waste collection portion of the proposed Casella contract. You might recall from our previous debate, what we are recommending is that should this amendment pass for FY26, that the town seek to negotiate a 1-year extension of Casella's existing contract, which covers both recycling collection and I believe some large item collection, bulky items, mattresses, and some hauling services. So we have provided sufficient funding to pay for that 1-year extension in the purchase of services object class based on prior year costs. We've also included in the new proposed DPW budget a budget reserve of the difference in service costs between in-house provision and contracted provision. In this case, it's a little over $210,000. That could be used to pay a short-term negotiating fee or penalty that might be associated with an abbreviated negotiating period to receive or to guarantee that 1-year extension. So we have the funding provided as well as a separate budget reserve to fund any incidental costs.
And could I just add that? Could I just add, if you don't mind, Harry? Casella is highly incentivized to extend that contract because they use our transfer station to dump up to 100 tons per day of their non-Brookline trash. So it is unimaginable to me that they would give it up. Thank you.
Janice?
I guess that's okay. I'm concerned that we don't actually, come June 1st, we won't have any contracts with Casella because there is no.
Again, they're highly incentivized, Janice, because of the use of the transfer station to continue it. And frankly, as a matter of good practice, I should think, because this contract is conditioned on town meeting approval, it might have been a good idea to negotiate an extension should town meeting not approve the contract back in January when it was signed. That's
not on the table for us tonight.
That's not on the.
There is more time. There's certainly time. There's a 30-day period, right, between town meeting and when the contract expires, which is on July 1st.
I guess the person who wanted to answer this question is actually Melissa, as the only person from the sixth floor who's actually present, who is responsible for our budget to, to give me her perspective. Thanks.
On the ability to renegotiate without any competitive environment, a 1-year agreement with
No,
a
it's an
contractor.
extension. The question is an extension of the recycling contract.
A
Which they
recycling
currently
contract
have.
with a vendor that we just reneged a contract with, and you think that they're gonna be open
It's
to
not
providing?
reneging because of
Okay, guys,
conditions.
please.
Well, yeah, it's not reneging.
Okay. I think that we are concerned, and we had a 10% estimate in the budget when we originally proposed the amendment. The petitioners have reduced that to 5. I think that there's still concern about the ability to provide the service under this amendment.
Again, they're highly incentivized.
Thank you. Anthony Buono?
I have nothing else to say. My fellow petitioners have said what I would have said.
Thank you. Any more comments or questions? Let me repeat that. Any more comments or questions? Dennis, we're ready for a motion.
All right, so I will take a motion from someone for favorable action on this Lebovitz amendment to warrant Article 9, which would make the corresponding adjustments to the DPW budget, as well as add the condition that was discussed a few moments ago in response to the question from Linda.
So moved.
Second.
And then seconded. All right. And so now if you're in favor of the amendment, which would, I think we've debated quite at length lately, which would have the various effects on the DPW, you're going to vote yes. If you want to keep the budget as we've previously voted it, you're going to vote no. And I'm going to share my screen. All right, now Michael Berger is
Still
not
not here.
Not here until 8. Ben Birnbaum.
No.
Harry Boris is not here. Cliff Brown.
No.
Anthony Buono.
Yes.
John Doggett.
No.
Catherine Florio.
No.
Harry Friedman.
Yes.
David Mark Goldstein.
Yes.
Neil Gordon.
Yes.
Susan Granoff.
Yes.
Barry Grossman.
No.
Kelly Hardebeck.
No.
Elisa Jonas.
Yes.
Janice Kahn.
Abstain.
Alec Lebovitz.
Yes.
Carol Levin.
No.
Is Pam's not here, right?
No,
Jocelyn.
Pam's gone all week.
Okay, Jocelyn Murphy.
Yes.
Danelle O'Neill.
Yes.
Linda Olson Pelkey. I don't hear Linda.
Oh, no, I said no.
Sorry. Mark Penzel.
No.
Fran Perler.
Abstain.
David Pollock.
No.
Lee Selwyn.
Yes.
Chris Westfall.
Abstain.
Dennis Dowdy. No. Motion fails by a vote of 11 in favor, 10 in favor, 11 opposed, and 3 abstentions.
May I ask if anyone wants to change their vote?
You can propose reconsideration.
I won't. I won't. We'll move on.
We're going to move on to warrant article 14 and 15. If you thought that conversation was fun, this next one will probably be equally fun. This is complicated. It is, as you saw from the report, there is a a split on the subcommittee in terms of what the path forward could and should look like. The set of votes we're going to take tonight may end up being complicated because there are a variety of different proposals on the table to address this issue. I suspect that there will be many members of the subcommittee who wish to weigh in on either the process or the substance. I am hoping that we can keep our comments as focused as much as possible on the substance, because that's what's before us tonight. And unfortunately, none of the motions that are going to be on the table tonight, or with the possible exception of the original petitioner's motion, have been considered by the subcommittee in their current form. I think it will be helpful if the subcommittee the subcommittee report tonight, try to educate this body as much as possible without making any recommendation, because the subcommittee has no recommendation. And then we can leave it up to the proponents of each of the proposals on the table to explain the benefits of what they're proposing and any concerns they might have about the alternatives. Because it is important for us to have a recommendation for town meeting, and because I assume, although I cannot assert this, I assume that because of the benefits associated with a referral motion over a recommendation of no action on any of the subject matter here, if we get through our complicated series of votes tonight on warrant article 14 without a recommendation, I will certainly entertain the opportunity to reopen and can take a referral motion at the end, just so you guys understand that. I know that Harry, you had some comments you would like to make as well before we get into the discussion, before we turn it over to the subcommittee. So the floor is yours.
No, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip, and we can go straight to the subcommittee report.
All right, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I have the pleasure of giving the subcommittee report for a evenly split committee. So the Federal Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, and the Massachusetts Anti-Discrimination Law and the Massachusetts Zoning Act require towns to make reasonable accommodations in their land use and zoning regulations and practices for individuals with disabilities, unless doing so, and this is important, would impose an undue financial or administrative burden on the town or fundamentally alter the nature of the town's zoning scheme. These laws also require an interactive process in which individuals with disabilities engage in a collaborative dialogue with the town to identify and evaluate effective and reasonable accommodations. Brookline currently has no written policy or bylaw spelling out how this reasonable accommodation process will be conducted. It currently responds to any requests for reasonable accommodations with an ad hoc process. And I will clarify that to say that if somebody requests a ramp, you're entitled to a ramp as a matter of right, regardless. So there's not, there's no worry about the process there. The lack of such a codified process ultimately derailed petitioner's defense of the reasonable accommodation she had gotten from the town and that the ZBA had approved unanimously in land court when a neighbor challenged the town's decision. The purpose of warrant articles 14 and 15 is to codify a reasonable accommodation process in the town's bylaws to prevent that from happening again. The principal issues that divided the subcommittee are the following. Who should decide the application for reasonable accommodation? The building commissioner on the one hand, or the zoning board of appeals on the other, and how much time should be provided? Second, Who should hear and decide issues relating to medical and disability-related information, including whether an accommodation is needed, and how can the applicant's privacy best be protected? And corollary to that, to what extent should the general public, and in particular abutters, participate in the process, either through some kind of information gathering or public hearings? Petitioner argued strongly against allowing any participation by the public. The town believes that some public participation is either appropriate or acceptable, as do members of the subcommittee. It was noted that the City of Somerville's reasonable accommodation ordinance allows for no public hearings or participation. On the other hand, the Massachusetts Office on Disability, the MOD, guidance anticipates that although public meetings are not necessarily required, if, for example, the enforcement officer has a question about whether the modification would undermine the basic purpose of the zoning bylaw that they cannot resolve on their own, then the matter could go before the Zoning Appeals Board, and certain aspects may need to be discussed at an open meeting. MOD emphasizes, however, that, quote, information about the applicant's disability should not be discussed at the open meeting. 3, how can the town's land use boards and commissions be involved in the interactive process to determine the appropriate accommodations, particular features and designs? Because petitioner's warrant article does not provide for any public hearings, the nature of any public comment is not an issue under her proposal. Because, and I'm going to refer to them as the PPS and Benka versions, the PPS version is the Penzel Pollock staff version. I did not name that, I'm just repeating it. And then the Dick Benka versions provide for public hearings. The nature of public comment becomes an issue because of privacy concerns regarding the medical details of an applicant's disability. The PPS version, recognizing the MOD's guidance and the ADA coordinator's advice, the town ADA coordinator's advice, that medical details should not be a matter for public consideration or debate, limits any public comment to 3 categories of information. First, whether the requested accommodation would impose an undue financial or administrative burden on the town. Second, whether the requested accommodation would require a fundamental alteration in the nature of the town's land use and zoning or building program. And third, impacts on abutting property and the neighborhood. The Benka version adds the issue of whether the accommodation is necessary to the issues that boards or commissions can consider. Fourth, must the accommodation be removed when the need for it no longer exists? Well, thankfully, that's no longer an issue because both of the versions now currently essentially align. So just put that in there for completeness and to sort of give ourselves something to clap about. Now, there are currently 3 versions of a bylaw for warrant Article 14 before you. First, obviously, is petitioner's version. Its process is completely administrative. There's no public input. The building commissioner decides with input from certain boards and commissions, not including the planning board, and whether an accommodation should be granted. Petitioner now, however, agrees that the planning board can be included. Then there is the PPS version. This version is the one labeled Penzel Pollock Staff Draft in your materials. Because it was felt that getting to the 2/3 vote required would not be possible without allowing for some public input, I, working with David Pollock, began working with John Buckheit, Associate Town Council, in early April on a version that we felt would have a better chance of passage. This went through several iterations as we attempted to address concerns of subcommittee members, the public, staff, and other boards, all while attempting to create a process that remained prompt and efficient and respected the disabled individual's privacy as required by the ADA. For example, highlights of this version include the building commissioner makes the decision and the ADA coordinator decides whether disability exists and if the accommodation is needed. And building commissioner makes that decision with input from boards and commissions. The time to increase the decision was increased from the petitioner's 30 days to 45, and finally to 60 days, plus extensions under certain circumstances. For example, if boards or the building commissioner needs additional information. The planning board was involved, first iteration at the discretion of the building commissioner, and now it's involved on a required basis. Public input is allowed at any public meeting or hearing, but not on any topic questioning the applicant's disability or the need for the particular accommodation. Boards or commissions may not consider disability or the need for the accommodation. And finally, after the building commissioner's decision, an appeal to the ZBA Zoning Board of Appeals is allowed, but aggrieved non-applicants could only appeal on issues not related to the applicant's disability or the need for the particular accommodation. And the ZBA is called upon to act, quote, as expeditiously as possible, unquote. Now, this version was never formally voted on by the subcommittee, but it is very similar to the version that attracted 3 votes at our 3rd meeting on May 9th. The other version is the Benka version, the Dick Benka version. Dick's specific version was also never voted on by our subcommittee. However, it places the ZBA in the primary decision-making role, which is consistent with a view that also attracted 3 votes at the subcommittee. Its highlights include, for example, the building commissioner issues the final decision, but that decision is governed by decisions from any other board and any other boards and commissions, including the ZBA, that have considered the application. In other words, the building commissioner's decision must conform to the decisions of the other boards and commissions. Second, and this is a quotation, boards and commissions shall conduct their part of the interactive process to generally follow their standard process for cases requesting relief and that do not require reasonable accommodation. This includes the board or commission's standard process for public notice, public meetings, or public hearings. The time to make the decision, and Dick's going to have to help me on this because I still don't fully understand how it works, but I'm going to do my best. And I'm sure he'll explain it better when he has a chance. His version says 45 days unless relief from a zoning requirement is requested. And I would just add that, which by definition will always happen because that's why you're asking for a reasonable accommodation. So after that, it's then an indeterminate amount until the application is complete. There's 30 days for the planning board to consider the application, then a period in between, and then there's 35 days for the zoning board of appeals to consider it and issue its decision. And then once it hands it off to the building commissioner, there's no deadline for him to issue the final decision. Last, the boards or commissions may discuss, regarding the privacy issue, they may discuss the criteria in sections 8B consistent with the confidentiality provisions of section 7. I know that means nothing to you as I read it. So section 8B reads whether the requested accommodation is necessary as defined in subsection 2C above. And paragraph 2C reads, an accommodation is considered necessary if it directly alleviates a barrier preventing an individual with a disability from enjoying or using their property on an equal basis with others. So put in plain language, the boards or commissions may consider whether or not an accommodation is necessary. And I think that in a nutshell sort of highlights the highlights. I will say in deference to a member of our subcommittee that at the end of all our process, we deadlocked 3-3 on all the votes, But at one point, there was a vote 3-2 in favor of a Selwyn amendment to make the ZBA sort of the decision maker. But it was only 3-2 because one of our members who was in India had dropped off the call because of internet problems, was able to get back 7 minutes later, and we revoted, and it was then 3-3. So that's the subcommittee report as I see it. Thanks.
All right, Harry, it doesn't appear as if there's
one last thing. Sorry,
Go ahead.
I didn't bring up anything about warrant Article 15 because 15 has not been nearly as controversial or problematic. So should I go ahead and do 15?
Yes, please.
Okay, so warrant Article 15 is not an amendment to the zoning bylaw, but is amendment to the general bylaw and only requires a 50% vote by town meeting. Obviously, the warrant Article 15 requires a 2/3 vote. And it essentially amends the demolition delay bylaw by essentially exempting from the delay allowing the building commissioner to exempt from the delay any building in which a reasonable accommodation has been granted. And the subcommittee voted 3-1-1 in favor of an amended version of warrant Article 15. And the amendment came both from the subcommittee and from Tina McCarthy, the preservation planner, and that has since been adopted by the Preservation Commission with one small little change. So the questions that arose under Article 15 are, what really constitutes a fundamental alteration of the demolition delay bylaw. And petitioner had argued that because the bylaw already contains provisions for emergency demolitions, her provision does not fundamentally alter the bylaw. Warrant Article 15 only applies after the request for a reasonable accommodation is granted. So during the hearing on May 9th, when warrant Article 15 was finally discussed in detail, the Preservation Department offered the opinion that, at least as to the demolition delay bylaw, as opposed to the substantive requirements governing local historic districts, the question is really moot. This is because the only thing the demolition delay provides for is delay, and a non-disabled applicant can simply run out the clock and then proceed with demolition. In other words, the fundamental purpose of this bylaw is simply delay, in the hope that the delay will lead to unspecified better outcomes. Applying the same requirement to a disabled applicant seeking a reasonable accommodation would expose the town to litigation because it runs afoul of federal law that requires that the decision be prompt and without undue delay. So why has the Preservation Department suggested amending the article? It was amended because the department feared a blanket exemption to the bylaw could possibly be considered a fundamental alteration of it. While the preservation planner offered the opinion that the article as proposed is probably reasonable, she added language that requires a hearing solely on the issue of significance, which can happen very quickly because of the problems encountered by petitioner in the appeal to land court, where there had been no hearings at all in the town's ad hoc process. She stated that although there might be a pro forma stay issued upon a finding of significance, it will, in a subsequent quick administrative process, always be lifted, as not to do otherwise is the kind of unnecessary delay prohibited by federal law. Now, why won't a second hearing be required before the stay is lifted, which ordinarily is a possibility? Well, a second hearing is not required of a non-disabled applicant who can simply decide to run out the clock. A second hearing is simply at the option of any applicant. The preservation planner believes that leaving the process as an advisory one that is handled by staff and any necessary technical experts advising the building commissioner would be the best hybrid solution. The preservation planner also stated that she does not want to put Preservation Commission members through an exercise where their only two options are either to lift the stay or to continue the stay and violate federal law by creating a burdensome delay. Town council also stated that making a disabled applicant wait an additional time is facially discriminatory. For this reason, the preservation planner also rejected an opinion from a member of the public, arguing that the applicant be required to go through a second hearing under Section 5.311, which concerns the normal process for lifting a stay on an emergency basis. Under that scenario as well, she does not want to place the commission in a position where it faces the same two options. And for the same reasons, she believes that handling that on an administrative basis is preferable. Who participates with staff during the post-hearing administrative process? That is going to be the staff planner, the chair of the commission, and then another member of the commission who is an architect. I believe I've got that right. And then the department would work, yes, that's correct, who would then also engage with the building commissioner. Now, does amending the demolition bylaw have any effect on local historic districts? The answer is no. The demolition bylaw is never enforced in a local historic district. They are two separate bylaws. They are administered separately, and amending the demolition bylaw has no effect on the local historic districts of Brookline. And that's the report. And on that basis, the subcommittee voted 3 in favor, 1 against, and 1 abstention.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Marcus. And I think I actually made a mistake in having those two reports go together, because I thought they would be more similar than they ended up turning out to be. And I think that might be confusing and have those debates simultaneously. So I'm happy that you've given the reports, but I think we should probably try to limit most of our discussion now to warrant Article 14 and then go on to debate 15. Harry, I don't believe that there is any representative for the original petitioner on the call.
That is my understanding, Dennis. Dawn Oates is not on the call, and I believe I've seen her attorney's name somewhere, and I do not recognize any names on the list as being the attorney.
So with that, I think we should hear from Mr. Benka to talk about the so-called Benka. How did you refer to it, Marcus? I want to make sure.
The Benka version?
The Benka version, and then we can hear more about the PPS version, and then we will hear from clarifications from the subcommittee if they're still needed, and then debate from the full body. So go ahead, Dick.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Dick Benka, town meeting member, precinct 14. Former select board member and former chair of various zoning committees. I'm now a member of the Committee on Town Organization and Structure, but I'm speaking for myself tonight. And I will note that CTO&S voted to refer Article 14. The two proposals that are before you, the Benka version, as it's been called, and the PPS version, put one issue squarely on the table. Should the building commissioner or should the ZBA be the one making the decisions to allow, and to use the language of state law, violations of zoning regulations? Should we eliminate public notice and process before the ZBA? Concurrent with that, should we also strip the Preservation Commission of its authority over local historic districts? Should we strip the Conservation Commission of its authority over wetlands? Because all of that happens in the PPS draft. Under the PPS draft, the building commissioner simply considers, quote unquote, the input of boards and commissions, and then he has the sole authority to decide the reasonable accommodation request, whether to grant it with modifications, or to deny it. Let me just start by briefly looking at the Preservation and Conservation Commissions. Under the PPS draft, they send their comments, recommendations, or decisions to the building commissioner. That draft treats their actions of the boards and commissions as, quote, recommendations. The building commissioner then confers with the applicant out of public view. The building commissioner issues his decision, or their decision, as the language states, simply considering the decisions of the boards and commissions as input. Nothing says that the decision of either commission has to be honored. So decisions of local historic districts and wetlands protection shift from the Preservation Commission and Conservation Commission to the building commissioner under the PPS draft. Let's go to zoning, on which my memo and most of the attention has been focused. Here, the ZBA is now entirely out of the picture until after the building commissioner has already made any decision that would allow violation of the zoning bylaw. The planning board, after a meeting, submits an advisory report to the building commissioner, not to the Board of Appeals, as is now the case. And after receiving the recommendation from the planning board, if there's a recommendation for a modification, there's a process, again, out of public view, involving the applicant, a town planner, the planning board chair and another member of the planning board, the ADA coordinator, and the building commissioner. There's no notice to or involvement of butters or town meeting members. And then the building commissioner issues the decision, quote, after consultation with the ADA coordinator and town planner, unquote. And again, the recommendation of the planning board are simply input to be considered. My memorandum that I sent to the this committee on Sunday sets out the reasons why the ZBA and not the building commissioner should be making the decision to allow violations of zoning standards. That's what happens, first of all, in non-disability cases. It's supported by federal guidance and court decisions, which direct that normal zoning procedures should ordinarily be followed. It is consistent with Mass Office on Disability guidance. It is consistent with numerous cases where the Attorney General has approved zoning boards as the decision makers in reasonable accommodation cases. It's sound policy. It harnesses the combined expertise of a multi-member ZBA board with legal expertise that has been historically responsible for zoning decisions and has historically made those decisions in public, as opposed to a single decision maker with different expertise making a decision out of public view. And it clearly conforms to state law, whereas allowing the building commissioner to grant a building permit, quote, in violation of any zoning ordinance or bylaw, unquote, could run afoul of Chapter 48, Section 7, and frankly, spawn even more litigation. As to the ZBA under the PPS draft doesn't even make a recommendation before the building commissioner's decision. The ZBA becomes involved only on appeal of the building commissioner's decision, where it would, under Chapter 40A, Section 15 of state law, have fully 100 days to decide after the filing of the appeal. And also because any Preservation Commission or Conservation Commission decisions are no more than binding recommendations, and the building commissioner makes the actual decision on those matters as well, appeals regarding local historic districts and wetlands would apparently now also go to the ZBA under Section 10A of the PPS draft. Does all of that make any sense? In my view, it doesn't, and the ZBA should be involved prior to a decision on a reasonable accommodation request that would result in a violation of zoning standards, not just afterwards in a protracted appeal process. The decision on a reasonable accommodation request should conform to the ZBA decision, as well as those of other boards and commissions on issues within their jurisdiction. That's what my draft does in sections 6G and 6J. With confidentiality provisions made explicit in section 7, as explained on pages 3 to 4 of my memo. So the memorandum and my draft bylaw address other issues, including language in the Pollock draft that departs from state guidance and federal decisions, or on PPS draft, that depart from state guidance and federal decisions, in which I've tried to address. But much of that is explained in my memo. But there is this central issue of who will decide to allow violations of zoning bylaws, local historic district requirements, or wetlands protection requirements. And I think that those are the critical issues that this committee has to decide. So I thank you for tackling this. I just do want to respond to a couple of comments that Mark made. He argued that the boards or commissions should not, the ZBA, for example, or the planning board, should not consider the need for an accommodation. And let me just quote the Massachusetts Office on Disability, which has the following guidance for planning and zoning board members regarding the scope of their hearings. Quote, you will need to determine two things in the course of your hearings. One, whether the person has a disability-based need for the modification, and two, whether the modification requested is reasonable. And then the reasonableness question has two subsidiary questions. Would it cause undue hardship or fiscal or administrative burden on the municipality? And does it undermine the basic purpose that the zoning bylaw was set out to achieve? So the Massachusetts Office on Disability explicitly says that planning and zoning boards within their purview is the investigation of whether the person has a disability-based need for the modification. It urges confidentiality in that inquiry. I've built explicit confidentiality language into my version in section 7, tracking almost verbatim the language of the Massachusetts Office on Disability. And I've explained that on pages 3 to 4 of my memorandum. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. David, yes?
Can I, just a point of information, Dick, you, just for clarification, because Mark Penzel made the point of having said that he conferred with town council on his draft. You did that with yours as well. Is that correct?
Yes, and let me actually thank John Buchheit, who has been very responsive to all of the inquiries that we've posed during this process. So I have been conferring with town council as this process has gone forward.
Thank you, Lee. David, as one of the Ps on the PPS, would you like to offer some substance associated with your draft, and then we'll go to larger comments from the subcommittee and then questions?
What I'd like to do is defer in that Mark, as an attorney with experience with reasonable accommodation, I asked him many weeks ago to take the lead on this, and he's worked intensively with staff over that whole period of time. And to Lee's question, I think the difference here is that, and I've worked with Mark and with staff, is that what Mark and I have been trying to do is get staff's recommendations as best as we could and incorporate them into our draft. And that's why staff is listed as part of the draft, is because they agreed that that they were participatory in crafting the parts and pieces of it. And so I've asked Mark to not only make the subcommittee report, but also to either present the arguments for the PPS draft. And I've also asked Attorney Buckheit and Senior Regulatory Planner, or Director of Regulatory Planning, Polly Selko, to speak. Unfortunately, Sarah Kaplan, the ADA coordinator, is running a meeting for the town elsewhere tonight and isn't here, but she may or may not have provided a statement to Town Council Buckheit. So I don't know whether to hand it. I mean, I'd like to hand it back to Mark, and then Mark, if you know whether John's going to lead off or however you want to do that. I haven't been on the choreography of how to present the PPS version.
All right.
Yeah, I'll lead off just initially. You mentioned Sarah Kaplan. We talked to her today. She had a chance to read both the PPS version and the Dick Benka version. And she said that she believes the Benka version is less protective of disabled applicants' rights, and that she prefers the PPS version to the Benka version. Hearsay, I know, but there were other people in the meeting, and I think they would confirm that that's what she said. Also, I think I'd like to ask David to confirm that he had a conversation with a member of the ZBA who said that the ZBA wants to have nothing to do with determining whether somebody has a need for an accommodation. Was that correct, David?
I spoke with Jesse Geller, who served for 20 years on the ZBA and also was a author along with Town Council Buckheit. It's my understanding of the ZBA ruling on the case that led to this. And, I really wanted to know about what he thought the ZBA could and couldn't do if they were the deciding party. And he said that as they had previously in that ruling, that he was comfortable and they were capable of making decisions on what in these various versions are called criteria C and D, which is the undue burden and the sort of upsetting of zoning. He said those were fine, and that criteria E, which is essentially the primary one that's going to be before the planning board as well as the zoning board. Is this the best solution? Should it be adjusted architecturally? He said that they rely on, as other people have said, they rely on the planning board's advice as the architects, but they were capable of issuing that ruling. But he said he really strongly felt that that for criteria A and B, whether there was a legitimate need for a reasonable accommodation and what that accommodation should be, what things are needed, he said, do not, in my opinion, put that responsibility on the zoning board, because they aren't trained for it or really the right people to decide that.
Okay. I want to respond to the claim that it would strip the Preservation Commission of jurisdiction in local historic districts. I mean, that there's nothing in here that does that. The building commissioner can't issue. I mean, if the Preservation Commission, I live in a local historic district, and if I don't get the certificate of appropriateness, believe me, I tried, for some change to my house, I'm not going to get the building permit or the electrical permit or anything else. So the building commissioner can't do anything beyond that. That's really a separate process that is not implicated by this. And as I said earlier, Tina, with respect to Article 15, Tina McCarthy said that they're really governed by two separate bylaws. In response to the argument that the zoning board of appeals is really preferable. I'd like to, I mean, if you look at the first page or the first point of Dick Benka's memo, he says only the Board of Appeals and not the building commissioner can grant zoning relief. That's his primary claim for why it's got to be the zoning board of appeals. I mean, that's basically assuming the result before you even had the argument, because what's going on here is we're amending the zoning bylaw. So if we want to, if the town wants to amend the zoning bylaw so that the zoning bylaw gives someone else the authority in limited circumstances of reasonable accommodations to make a change and grant relief, we can do that. So what's lacking from Dick's argument is any argument as to why the zoning board of appeals is better than the building commissioner in making this decision. And it's our position, or at least my position, that the building commissioner is better because he can he can draw in more expertise. He can draw in people from all over, something the ZBA cannot necessarily do. That the ZBA does not want to have anything to do with the necessity for the accommodation, something that the building commissioner can handle with the ADA coordinator. So the staff believes that, at least in this respect, the PPS version is better, principally for two reasons. Because one, it reduces the number of public hearings or meetings. In our version, there really is only one, and unless the Preservation Commission is implicated or maybe some other body is implicated, but there's certainly not this ZBA involvement early, and it better protects the privacy of the applicant. You know, I understand Dick's point in quotation in reference to the MOD's guidance about getting, you know, commissions in getting involved in that. That does not necessarily make it good or the best. I mean, we want to do something that, or at least I want to do something that most thoroughly protects the privacy of the applicant, and that I have learned from dealing with the petitioner in her experience, excuse me, would be better. And it is better to have those issues handled administratively out of the sight of the public. And the PPS version does allow for the public to weigh in on all sorts of other issues, just not those issues. And there's no response to our claim that, and John Buckheit can support this because he's the one who had the conversation with the general counsel of MOD, who told him that when he had tried to even get the Disability Commission involved as part of a written policy, she told him she would advise against it. I mean, there was nothing illegal about it, but that it's not a good idea because those types of public commissions are not trained in how to handle this type of information, and it unnecessarily risks the disclosure of information, medical information, that should not be disclosed. Another point that Dick makes is that regarding the federal decisions, saying that a federal decision allows the Zoning Board of Appeals to be involved does not mean we have to do it, or that it may be legal, but it's not necessarily the best way to go about doing it. And the PPS version, we feel, is the better way of doing it. It touches all the boxes. It allows public input to the extent public input does not impinge on the individual's privacy, and gets the ZBA involved in situations where somebody's aggrieved and feels that there's really a basis for an appeal.
Mark, I would like, at the risk of derailing, I would like to stop there simply because I
just want one more point. I understand. I'm droning on, but I'll also say that Dick's version, at least in one respect, is also facially discriminatory against disabled applicants. He has the board, the planning board being given 30 days to give its report to the zoning board of appeals. Whereas if you were a non-disabled applicant applying for a special permit, the planning board would only have 20 days to get that report to the zoning board of appeals. And we in the PPS version explicitly incorporates that provision of the 20-day provision for reports to the ZBA. So I'll end on that.
Yeah, I was not intending to imply that you were droning on. What I was intending to imply is that we've gotten to the point where if this becomes a debate between you and Dick, it's gonna cause members to not have a chance to understand what's really going on here. And I do have one question, and I'll ask you as a representative of the subcommittee, but I'm hoping that this is an easy question. Is the fact that the committee, is it reasonable to conclude that the subcommittee, despite being unable to come out with a unified recommendation for one or more of these proposals, that the subcommittee prefers these proposals to the petitioner's original because there are flaws that the subcommittee agrees, or is that an unreasonable assumption to make? I'm trying to understand as we start crafting the vote later on, like what inferences can be drawn from that.
I think it's a little more complicated than that. I think we all agree that the petitioner's proposal is not workable, and if that were the only thing on the table, I think that we would probably support referral, which is what CTOS did. But we took a vote on referral, and the vote on that was also split 3-3. I can tell you personally that I would support referral over the PPS version. I would not. I think, however, that what we were all trying to do.
But the question I was really trying to get at was whether you generally would prefer support referral over the petitioner's version.
Well,
that was the question.
I think probably yes, but I think what we were all trying to do was to get to a point where we could actually do something for the petitioner in terms of getting something done. Because if we left it just at the petitioner's version, I think we probably, if that were the only thing on the table, I think we would probably, the consensus would probably be referral. And I can't speak for everybody, but that's my impression.
Okay. Dennis, I'll speak more later, but I cannot affirm your statement that.
Okay. I was just trying to understand, and I thought maybe the answer would be simple. If it's not simple, we'll defer it for later discussion.
I said it was.
Yep. No, that's fine. Harry, I'm going to turn it over to you to go for some questions.
I was going to just ask Polly and John to
No,
not yet. No.
We need to go to the committee. If someone has a specific question.
I'm sorry. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, we'll get to them. I promise they'll get a chance to speak, but we need to get to the committee.
Neil Gordon.
Yeah, thank you, Harry. I'm going to try to drone for a somewhat shorter period of time than Marcus Penzel.
You mean the subcommittee members don't take priority here?
No, they don't.
Okay.
You're on the list,
okay.
But I don't really think that this constant back and forth on details, and you said this, and he said that, and she said that, is really helpful to the rest of us on the advisory committee.
That wasn't what I was going to talk about.
Neil.
Thank you, Harry. First of all, let me say, I fully support a private and expedited process. And I have sort of a comment and question sandwich, some of which Mark Penzel may have answered. I'll start here. So what I heard from Dick Benko was 3 times use the term violation of the zoning bylaw. But I heard Marcus say, if we amend the zoning bylaw in whatever way we amend it and follow the process, for example, a fully private expedited process involving the ADA coordinator and a permit issued by the building inspector. If that's what the zoning bylaw says, then I'd ask, where's the violation? And is that still a violation? So maybe that's been asked and or not asked and answered by Marcus. I'm hearing that in trying to get something done that will pass, I oppose referral back to the select board. The select board had plenty of time to solve this through policy and hasn't done anything. And it's, I mean, this is as I understand it, an issue that's been festering for 5 years. And, you know, where have they been? But I'm led to believe that part of the involvement of planning board, for example, is an effort not to accommodate the needs of the applicant, but an effort to try and get to the 2/3 majority of town meeting. And if that's the case, then I think that those suggesting that particular, it's the David Pollock, Mark Penzel amendment, I believe, or motion, that they're understating, I think, the support that town meeting may show for a fully private, expedited, to use that term again, expedited process. I don't think that a 2/3 majority on that particular motion is out of the question. I'll say this further, that if a motion to refer is defeated, as I think it should be, and the original, as printed in the warrant motion, becomes the main motion, either because there are no amendments or the amendments are defeated. If town meeting votes on that motion and it gets, for example, a 60% vote, it will fail. I think that's a strong referral to the select board. And I challenge them to ignore the vote of 60% of town meeting and not take expedited action to come up with a policy and solve this problem.
Thank you. Janice Kahn.
Thank you, Harry. So my question to Dick was just to understand why the referral to the select board. I mean, why was that CTO&S's recommendation? Was my question to him. And I have a second question, which is I'd like a little bit more clarification about the planning board's role in the PPS version that the petitioner apparently said that would be okay. I think there should be some kind of public process. I'm not sure it needs to be before the ZBA. I think the planning board can have a good role, but I would like to understand what that role would be, and maybe Polly Selko could clarify. 2 questions.
Do you want me to answer that now, or?
Yes, yes, please.
Well, I think the planning board is the board that looks at design and would be able, with the architects on the board, to come up with any design modifications if a design modification could lessen the impact to an abutter. So that's why I think they're important. I think also that they can also opine on whether it is within the scope of zoning. So I think if the actual bylaw says that the planning board can make that decision, then I think it's legal, and it doesn't have to be the Board of Appeals that makes the decision about the zoning relief. Does that answer your question?
That's helpful. Thanks very much, Polly.
If it's helpful, I could share the specific text in the PPS version that says exactly what the planning board's going to do, but I would have to be given screen share privileges.
Do you feel like you need that right now, Janice? Because I'm
No,
happy to.
I can summarize it in 3 sentences.
Okay.
Please do.
So the planning board does its regular regular meeting process and with public notices, and then they provide their recommendation, their advisory back to the building commissioner as opposed to the zoning board. And if their advice is that they like what was presented as the reasonable accommodation, then that's the end of the planning board's participation. But if they propose any kind of alteration, then there's in 6G under in the text of the bylaw, it says that a town planner, capital T, capital P, which I assume is maybe somebody like Polly, and the chair of the planning board and another member of the planning board, one of those two being an architect, then go and participate in the interactive process with the building commissioner and the ADA coordinator.
Thanks, David. And my other question was to Dick about the referral and
I think we reached a point in our meeting, having looked at a number of issues around both of these proposals. And I think there were concerns raised about both, issues raised about both. And it appeared that CTO&S did not have the bandwidth to solve those at that point in the evening, or should I say at that point at night. And the referral motion was made and passed.
Thanks very much, Dick.
Harry Friedman. So I think what I've heard said in other instances, but nobody's actually said it here. The basic difference between these two proposals, as far as I can see, is that the PPS one looks upon this as a disability issue with some zoning implications. And the Benka looks at this as a zoning issue with some disability implications. And I think it falls down on the privacy and who's going to make decisions. The building commissioner in this town, until the current building commissioner, has generally been a member of the trades. He, and it's always been a he, has been an electrician or a plumber or something like that. And I'm not sure that that's the person. If Dan Bennett were to retire and we go back to the traditional way we choose building commissioners, I'm not sure that's the kind of person you want making decisions here on the zoning stuff or the disability stuff. I'm not sure that the ZBA is the perfect resource to make these decisions. I mean, I can see why one of the proposals has them involved. They have attorneys there. They have architects. They have some scholarly background here. But frankly, I'm not all that thrilled with Brookline ZBA and the decisions they've made in the past. So I'm not sure in a perfect world I'd give it to them. It's no surprise that Sarah Kaplan, the disability administrator, favors the one proposal here that most favors the people living with disabilities. There's a tension here between the person with disabilities who's entitled to a reasonable accommodation and the property rights of the surrounding neighbors and the rest of the town. And the fact that Sarah Kaplan comes down on the disability side, wow, what a surprise. Who would have thought? That's her job. The more I listen to this argument back and forth, the more I think that CTO&S was right. I don't think either one of these proposals is ready for prime time. I think town meeting deserves a well-crafted, well-thought-out approach that basically curries favor with the advisory committee, the select board, CTO&S, the disability community, and the people who are interested in public process, knowing what's going on the property next door to them and having some sort of say. And I don't think either one of these probably does that to the extent that they could. And I will most likely be voting for a referral because these things are half-baked. And I think the public and the town deserve better. Linda Olson-Pelkey.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think you folks are getting a taste of what we've been living with for weeks and weeks. And what we've been hearing are lawyers arguing, right? So I don't think there is agreement. I think that Mark did a disservice a little bit in his presentation in that he named bullet points that he thought were differences between the versions. And he said that the Banca, I will call it the Banca Selwyn version, just for the heck of it, did not protect the privacy of the applicant, and that is clearly not true. And he also intimated that it was going to be up to the ZBA to decide whether or not an accommodation was needed. This is also completely not true. And when we get to the question of notice and meetings and abutters having any ability to comment on the ramifications of an accommodation, not to block it, not to stop it, but to be part of the iterative process, I don't see that in the PPS version at all. I mean, Janice asked David to describe the planning board process, but when it comes time to discuss the design of the accommodation, that is done in private. So no, the public isn't having any input there. We also heard from David that he spoke to someone on the ZBA, and what he said was very important because what he heard from the member of the ZBA that he spoke to was that they are a logical board, a logical body to decide the question of reasonableness. That big question of does granting the accommodation violate the nature of our zoning bylaw? And I don't think the building commissioner can decide that. And I think having members who have been administering the zoning bylaw and deciding what's an acceptable deviation from it, these are the people who have the best skills to decide that. So I think these threats, perceived threats to the privacy and the rights of the applicant being taken away somehow in the Banca version just doesn't hold up. It just does not hold water. It is not legitimate point. So, yeah, I mean, I think half of us feel strongly that these protections, it would be a better balance for both the applicant and the neighborhood and the town. And I think we are striving for that balance. I mean, everyone can spin scenarios where somebody abuses the process or, tries to take advantage. And we have to be prepared for that on both sides of the question, the applicant question and the property owner question. So I still maintain my preference for the Banca version. I think it makes a lot more sense. I think it puts the decision-making in the hands where it needs to be. I also think concentrating all of that power in one individual who may be a tradesman, may be you know, any individual, we can, you know, hardly imagine who it might be. I think it's dangerous. And I think we're much better protected as a town to have more eyes on the question, as it were. So if we cannot decide between these two versions, and there is a threat that it's not going to pass town meeting, I would also go for referral. I mean, I don't think, you know, we've seen changes the very last minute. I haven't even reviewed them. I don't know what's in the PPS version. I didn't have time to read it today. I had other things I had to do. And probably many of you, this is true for as well. So I just think it's a little outrageous that we're being asked to decide these questions right now, tonight, between these two versions. So I guess I will hold my comments till later if necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't want to use Benka Selwyn because I didn't want people using the initials for that proposal. Carol Levin.
Aye. So I think my concerns aren't anything that have been voiced, and they apply to all the versions. And I'm looking for someone to tell me why I shouldn't be concerned about this. The applicant under these all versions is the individual with disability. Now, a large portion of our housing stock are condos, and a lot of them are 2 and 3 unit condominium associations. And I'm just wondering how, I don't see any provisions for how this process incorporates or recognizes the rights of the other condominium owners or the requirements that may be in the condominium documents. And do we run the risk of approving something that could be creating a financial liability for other condo owners if we say, go ahead and do this to common areas? So I'm just wondering why I shouldn't be worried about those situations under these proposals.
This might be a good time to let John speak if since he's been waiting so patiently. You're muted.
All right, I just lost my audio button there for a moment. And maybe, you know, Polly might have some input what happens in the planning process, but I think like many things in the legal world, you know, one has to, there have to be several boxes that need to be checked. And in the condo world, my understanding is that, you know, those are private property rights that people are talking about. And I think, you know, you can't run afoul of your condo docs as a general rule. Now, that being said, I don't have any experience that I'm aware of the ZBA kind of running into a conflict and putting in, you know, perhaps there have been occasions where they put in a condition that says that, you know, you do have to abide by that, but I don't have any firsthand knowledge of that. So,
well, typically, if it's a condo, when they apply to the building department, they're supposed to submit a letter from the condo association agreeing to whatever it is they want to do, if it affects the common areas.
So in theory, that would be the requirement here also, is what you're saying, even though it doesn't read that way.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you know, the question you brought up has not been brought up previously.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's another argument for referral.
Well, I think if I could just offer an opinion, I don't think it would implicate the zoning bylaw to make a change to a common area.
Well, you
only implicates the zoning bylaw if you, for instance, you wanted to put a lift on the outside and it happened to be in the setback in order to get somebody up into their room or building. So I mean, we're only talking about changes that implicate the zoning bylaw and making internal changes to a building, although it may, you know, implicate a building permit.
So Marcus, here's what I would say. Say you have a 2-family that's a condo and you want to put a ramp out front and that needs a zoning waiver.
Well, that doesn't. because that's, you're
Okay.
entitled to a ramp as a matter of right under state law.
Okay, so maybe it doesn't matter.
A ramp under state law is, has a blanket
Exemption.
permission, blanket exclusion. A lift does not. So a lift that encroached on a setback would require zoning relief.
Although it's my understanding, I think it came up in our hearing that our building commissioner treats a lift the same as a ramp. That's between the building commissioner and whoever's applied.
All right, Carol, are you?
Am I satisfied? I think it's a question that maybe merits a little bit more thought in the final version of the bill is my impression, but thank you.
No, I didn't mean satisfied. I just meant, did you have more questions you wanted to ask?
No, I'm taken care of. Thanks.
Perry, you put a question in the chat. Did you want to ask it or?
Yeah, that's my question. Could the PPS and Bank of proponents each talk about the estimated timeframes that are likely under each of their processes? And I do, recognize there could be multiple paths, but likely paths.
Dick, would you like to go first?
Well, yeah, and I do know that both Kelly and these may not be helpful to our discussion, but Kelly and Catherine have been doing diagramming, but maybe we hold off on that. Anybody else who, John or Mark or Polly can correct me, but I believe that the time frame for the PPS is quite straightforward. It's now a baseline of 60 days, and that's because while staff feedback to the building commissioner is asked for within 21 days, feedback from boards and commissions is asked for within 45 days. And so that's a pretty tight time frame to provide, timely granting of a reasonable accommodation. So overall 60 days. And within that, you have to fit the 45 days for another board to do its action. That's a maximum of 45 days. So the hope is they can schedule expeditiously and compress the time frame. But what's really important is that any request for additional information from the applicant stops the clock on that. So the primary place is if an applicant comes in and asks for a reasonable accommodation and the building commissioner says, okay, that's great. That starts the clock. But if the building commissioner says, you need architectural plans sufficient for planning board review, and these are the requirements for that, and the applicant says, oh, I don't have any plans, then the building commissioner says, okay, well, the clock is hereby stopped right away, and you need to develop the complete application. And it's only when the application is completed, meaning really basically the documents that would be that Polly and Dan Bennett would say, this is sufficient. I think it would be Polly, this is sufficient package to to provide the planning board. And then that package gets published, Butters gets noticed. So that's, and then if other boards and commissions or other departments also say, hey, this information is missing, we need this information, then they ask Dan Bennett for that, the building commissioner, then he asks the applicant. And then as soon as he asks the applicant to provide new information, reasonable additional information, the clock stops until that's provided. So it's 60 days, but it expands whenever the applicant needs to provide more information. And that's it.
Wouldn't it also expand if notice is required and you have to publish it?
No, the notice at the planning board level is built in. So no, it's really done there. The other way that it can pause is if the applicant wants the clock to stop because they're not ready for some reason to have the building commissioner do a thumbs up or thumbs down or whatever, then if they say stop the clock, then that works too.
If I could just comment on the timeframes for a planning board and board of appeals, the planning board only needs about a week's time to send out notices to abutters for a planning board meeting. And then once the planning board votes, that's it. They can issue the decision, their decision to the building commissioner the very next day. With the Board of Appeals, the way it works now is you need to put a legal ad in the newspaper 2 consecutive weeks prior to the Board of Appeals hearing. And of course, you need a few days to put it in the paper. So that's like 2.5 weeks. Then when the Board of Appeals holds its hearing, makes a decision, someone has to write the decision, and that can take a couple of weeks. Then the decision is filed with the town clerk, and there's a 20-day appeal period. So those are the differences in the time frame. Now, could those be different if they were spelled out differently in a zoning amendment just for reasonable accommodation? I guess so, but I would have to ask actually John Buchheit what he thought about that.
Sure, I'm happy to comment if, yeah, no, I think, you know, we're trying to stay, I guess, stay within the zoning process, you know, and use things that are established to a certain extent. So I would, yeah, it gets, these are some complicated questions, but I don't think you have to, you know, stick right to those. I think it can be different. Because we are guided mostly, you know, by federal law, which, you know, there's the Supremacy Clause, and these are civil rights that are involved here, and so we do have to be very careful about not violating those, not taking too much time. So, yeah, I mean, just in case anyone doesn't know, there's no case law in the First Circuit, nor in Massachusetts, that bears on this issue, which is what process to use when someone requests a reasonable accommodation from zoning or other land use requirements. So this is really kind of, yeah, we're sort of, you know, this is uncharted territory, so it's particularly difficult. We could get sued from, you know, one side or the other side, and you know, who knows?
Right now in the Banca article, it doesn't say that you circumvent the usual process for calling a Board of Appeals hearing. So you would have to put in a legal notice in the paper.
Correct. It calls
Right.
for all the usual processes, and Dick, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but.
Right. Just to respond, both of the versions have provisions in at the beginning of section 6 that there are time periods for getting more information, asking the applicant for more information that extend any time period. All of those are within the control of the building commissioner and the applicant. Both of them have steps that are that have no time limit on them, where the building commissioner continues the interactive process after getting a planning board report. So there's no time limit there. The no time limit is imposed. I think David mentioned that there's a 60-day period under the PPS version. That I think he will agree. There's language that says that's unless extended as called for below, which includes requests for information regarding medical issues, regarding needs, and engaging in the interactive process. So under both of them, there is no real hard and fast time period unless there is a request that does not require zoning relief. But we're not talking about that here. So the time could be extended, frankly, in the building commissioner's judgment or needs without any hard and fast limit. It was mentioned that by Mark that my draft used 30 days for the planning board. Our zoning bylaw has a 20-day period, but state law has a 30-day period. If within which 30 days, if the planning board has not issued a decision, it's deemed to have agreed with the request as it then goes on to the ZBA, to the Zoning Board of Appeals. So I took the 30 days from that state law provision. I wouldn't have a problem with shortening the planning board to 20 days, given Polly's comments about how quickly they can act. There is one big difference, and that is that within the time constraints of my version, the ZBA has 35 days to act. You don't get to the ZBA until the appeals period under the PPS version. And at that point, under state law, under 40A Section 15, the ZBA has 100 days after the filing of an appeal to rule on an appeal. So you have a very, very significant time period, given the fact that the ZBA under the PPS version doesn't get involved until the appellate process kicks in. And then that's governed by state law, which is a 100-day time period. So I would argue that that is something that has to be considered if we're talking about time limits.
If I could just briefly respond, Harriet.
Yep.
I'm sorry if so I do want to point out that I think that we're hoping, and I could be dead wrong here, that the majority of these will not be appealed, and therefore there will not need to be ZBA involvement. Whereas I think in the Benka draft, it's always involved. So the hope is, and like I said, perhaps I'm dead wrong, but that we don't ever have to. So the process will be shorter because it doesn't happen, hopefully 9 out of 10 times or so.
David, you have a two-finger.
Yeah, I just want to also point out that in the PPS version, the issuance of the reasonable accommodation is the conclusion of that civil rights process. And so just in terms of the timeliness and the vulnerability of the town to lawsuit for not fulfilling its obligation to provide the reasonable accommodation, at that point they've provided it, the town has provided it. So that 100-day appeal process Dick talked about is a burden on the applicant to get through it, but it's not a burden on the town in the sense that the town, I think, John, is that right? The town's fulfilled its obligation at that point.
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
David, you're on the list. Do you want to stay on the list?
I do want to stay on the list.
Okay. Perry, I hope your question was crystal clear and being answered, and that you're okay.
I'm good.
Yeah. Lee Selwyn.
Thank you. Couple things. First, just for clarification, the reference to violations of the zoning bylaw refer to existing technical requirements such as setbacks, dimensional requirements, floor area ratios, that sort of thing. And none of the proposals here would alter those. They would alter the conditions under which they might apply. So I think that the term is still correct. In other words, if an applicant comes in with a proposal that in some way impacts the existing use tables, dimensional requirements, et cetera, that are in the zoning bylaw, those are the kinds of things that would have to be addressed. Let me make sort of a general comment about the way I have always approached zoning issues in the 16 years that I've been involved in on the land use subcommittee. To me, zoning is a social contract. And what I mean by that is that property owners forego certain rights to what they can do with their property, in exchange for which they receive certain protections with respect to what neighbors and abutters can do with their property. So there's a quid pro quo here. The problem I have had with the PPS version, and certainly with the petitioner's proposal, is that it is focused almost entirely on the rights of the person with a disability, and gives little or no weight at all to the rights of other property owners. For example, if a proposal comes in that would materially impact an abutter, for example, by involving the construction of a large building that is very close to the property line, it far exceeds the or violates the normal setback requirements with respect to side yards, backyards, front yards, or whatever. That affects abutters, but abutters would receive no notice that this proposal is pending. And if they don't receive a notice, they can't do anything about it. We apply. There are other situations that exist that that can result in a I hate to use the word violation, but in some alteration for the purpose of a particular application of an existing dimensional requirement, for example, or use requirement. Dover Amendment applications fall into this category. Dover Amendment applications trump zoning in certain respects. They certainly trump them with respect to certain use requirements. They trump them can trump them with respect to dimensional requirements. Same with 40B with respect to dimensional requirements. And what we do is we still require these to go through the process of review by the ZBA. Abutters are noticed. Abutters have an opportunity to be heard. The ZBA can consider abutter concerns, but at the same time, the ZBA is required to also respect the particular rights that the applicant has in those situations. And to me, the case of a disability application is really falls within the same category. We have a process for dealing with these things. And I think while it is very important that we respect the rights of a person with a disability, we also need to respect the rights of the community as a whole and of abutters in particular. And if you bypass those rights, what you're doing is undermining the social contract, but more importantly, you're potentially inviting considerable litigation. The case in point here on Beach Road, this has been going on, this litigation, this has been going on for years. And by the way, when it went to court, as I understand it, the court was prepared to uphold interrogatories that were propounded by the plaintiff in that case against the applicant that addressed would have required disclosure of matters that were private, that were considered private by the applicant in that case, and the applicant withdrew the lawsuit or withdrew the application rather than disclose that information. So you can only protect this stuff so far. If it gets to court, that stuff could potentially come out. The process that is envisioned by if I call it Selwyn Bank, I avoid the acronym problem. But then that sounds like select board, so maybe that's not right either. By the draft that Dick has presented, is attempting to create a balance. It respects the applicant's rights, but it also provides a mechanism where abutters are notified and abutters have an opportunity to be heard. Now, it does not give the abutters the same rights that they might have in the case of a matter that does not involve a disability, because the ZBA in this case can grant relief that it might not otherwise grant in with respect to providing a reasonable accommodation. But the bottom line is that the purpose of zoning, and that language seems to appear here in the requirement, is undermined when abutters are not involved and the community overall is not permitted to participate in the process. And where the rights of abutters are not given the same opportunity to be heard as in other zoning situations. And that's what we are trying to address here. I don't think there's any attempt to discriminate against a person with disabilities. In fact, I think it's just the opposite. I think that there are accommodations that are being proposed in this draft that absolutely respect that individual's rights and give deference to those individuals' rights. But what the Baker draft does, that the PPS draft does not do, is it also respects the rights of everybody else.
Thank you, Lee. I am not recognizing two fingers anymore, and I am skipping over temporarily the people who have already spoken. I will go to Catherine Florio.
Thank you. I think there are a couple of things that aren't 100% clear, just as somebody who's on the subcommittee and who's been listening to this. I'm just going to say what my questions are, and then I'm going to ask them in the order I think they're important. I don't think we discussed this on the subcommittee, and we certainly haven't talked about it tonight, but I'm wondering what happens under emergency requests. And when I think about emergency requests, I'm thinking about something that has to happen immediately because somebody will not be able to get into their home if this accommodation doesn't happen and they have no place else to live. So that's number one. Number two, we've talked a lot about what I've heard a lot of discussion from one person about what the other Warren article says regarding privacy and the other person about what the other article says about privacy. But I think privacy is really important here. And I don't think we're talking about the same kind of privacy when we're talking about each of the different Warren articles. So it's my understanding, well, no, I'm going to stop. And then the question is, when under each of these different articles are the abutters noticed? And under each of these different warrant articles, what can the abutters do? Because it was my understanding as somebody who sat on the subcommittee that there was a big difference in terms of notification, but there was not that much difference in terms of what abutters could do. So withholding notification from the abutters, it didn't seem to me got us anything. So I think the most important question is the difference in privacy and the different ways that the different warrant article, the people who wrote the warrant articles are thinking about privacy. And Dick, I'd like to ask you specifically, you're saying that the ZBA can make a decision on the reasonable accommodation or can talk about whether the accommodation is reasonable or not. And I would like you to tell us what information you think the ZBA is using to make this decision and where, in executive session, which is private, or in a public meeting.
Sure.
And then Marcus, I have questions for you regarding privacy.
I'm happy to answer that. And this really does relate to an earlier comment that it would be inappropriate to ask about what was needed. But it is okay to ask about what the best solution is or whether an alternative solution would work. Let me start with what is section 7 of the Benka draft, or the Selwyn Benka draft, which basically, in looking at the question of alternatives, looking at the question of needs, and looking at the question of privacy and confidentiality, outlines specific guidelines, which I have incorporated virtually verbatim in section 7, the confidentiality section of the draft that I did. The Massachusetts Office on Disability, talking about alternatives, says, during the course of your hearings, you may ask about alternatives that might meet the person's needs. You do not have to approve the exact modification requested if an alternative would provide equal access. It then goes on. You do not need to review medical documentation for the individual. You do not need the individual to provide their diagnosis. It may be appropriate in limited circumstances to request limited documentation from the individual's medical provider if their disability or their need for the requested modification is not obvious or known. In the limited circumstances, you may request medical records. You should not request medical records beyond a letter from a medical provider confirming the existence of the disability-based limitation and explaining the need for the requested modification. So the Massachusetts Office on Disability has set that as the framework for looking at alternatives and looking at needs. My section 7 on confidentiality states, the building commissioner and any department, board, or commission to whom information is transmitted, as well as every other individual or department in the town, shall maintain information submitted in support of a request for a reasonable accommodation as confidential to the greatest extent permitted under federal law, the open meeting law with a cite, and the public records law with a cite. And such information shall not be made available for public inspection unless required by law. That tracks the PPS language. I then go on. As provided by the Massachusetts Office on Disability, board or commission or the building commissioner, if board or commission approval is not required, may A, in deciding whether a requested modification is necessary, determine that an alternative modification would provide equal access, tracking the language. B, request limited documentation from a medical provider only if the disability or need for the modification is not obvious or known, tracking the language. And C, request documentation from a medical provider limited to confirmability-based limitation and explaining the need the requested modification would address, tracking the language. And then I add further, General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A1, executive sessions shall apply to any discussion of the physical condition or mental health of an individual. So I explicitly include, with regard to public meetings and public hearings, the executive session provision of the open meeting law, that discussions of physical conditions or mental health have to be an executive session. That ties together the question of alternatives, which the PPS version says that boards and commissions should be addressing, can be addressing, says the planning board can address that explicitly. That's the role of the planning board, ties it to determination of what needs are being met and providing equal access to meet those needs, and then ties it to the Mass Office on Disability limitations on inquiry into physical and mental conditions.
Thanks. And then that was actually an awful lot. I can imagine people who haven't heard that a lot probably have more questions, but mine specifically is, when you're looking at the reasonable accommodation, when you, so what you have in front of, so what the boards and commissions will have in front of them, or whoever's making this decision will have in front of them, is a set of plans. And then what they will be able to modify is not the content of the plans, but potentially moving things around or the content of the plans.
Well, I mean, let's assume that, I mean, I think they could modify the content of the plans, not just move things around. If the medical need is access, for example, and the proposal to satisfy the need for access includes much more than meets the need for access, then I would think you could modify the content of the plan. I mean, we're talking hypotheticals, and not just move things around, but basically say, look, this is the need. Now let's see how we can satisfy that need, provide equal access to satisfy that need in a way that has, for example, less of an impact on abutters.
Then how many public meetings under your proposal are you expecting?
I put a 35-day limit on the ZBA. I think that, you know, they have a 14 period, I believe, prior to that. So, you know, you'd have one public meeting, maybe two. This would not, it cannot under my proposal be protracted. There is without, let me just say, without the express agreement of the applicant.
And so was that 2 meetings of the ZBA or 2 public meetings total? I'm sorry, it's just, this is so complicated.
No, I mean, I didn't, there's no on the number of hearings, and there's no minimum put on the number of hearings. There's no, the only limitation is a time limitation.
Okay.
Under either proposal, for board or commission comments under the PPS version for the planning board, under the PPS version for the planning board, under our version for the ZBA under our version.
Thanks. Once the ZBA makes its decision and approves whatever approves with modifications, whatever the ZBA approves, under your version, the decision goes to the building commissioner and the building commissioner issues a permit. Under normal circumstances, the building commissioner's decision can be challenged to the ZBA. Are you envisioning in your warrant article that if the building commissioner, once the building commissioner has issued the permit, that there can be another challenge to the ZBA, or does your, and could you just tell us?
No, this actually is a discussion that I've had with John Buchheit of Town Council's office. As things stand now with special permits or variances, the building commissioner has to abide by the decision of the ZBA. If the ZBA says no permit, the building commissioner cannot issue a permit. If the ZBA says a permit's okay, the building commissioner can issue a permit. That sort of ministerial act of issuing the permit is simply a ministerial act. It follows what the ZBA has allowed or not allowed. And that to my way of thinking, would be the same under this scenario where the ZBA would say the reasonable accommodation is acceptable, it's not acceptable, it violates the fundamental nature of zoning, or there should be a modification to it. And the building commissioner would then be required to follow that directive. At the point the ZBA made its decision, because the building commissioner does not have discretion, my thought is, and my belief is that under our state law, under Chapter 40A, Section 17, there could be a judicial appeal by any person who would be aggrieved by the decision of the ZBA, that appellate rights would exist at that point. You would not have the ZBA make a decision, go to the building commissioner, who would issue or not issue a building permit, and then have to go back to the ZBA. You would, the state law explicitly states that any person aggrieved by a decision of the ZBA can appeal. And
to court, not to the ZBA, sorry.
To court, yeah, not back to the ZBA.
Then
Correct.
Under
Catherine, happy.
Yeah,
We'll happily come back to you as well, but we want to make sure other people get a chance to speak. It's been 15 minutes so far. I just want to give you a heads up.
All right, just quickly, I would like somebody to ask the same questions of the PPS version. Dick, when are the abutters noticed for the first time under your warrant article?
They would be noticed when there was the first public meeting, which would be the planning board meeting. If there were another, if it was zoning, if there were another commission that if you needed zoning relief, if there were another commission, I think under either version, they would be noticed when that other commission held a hearing or a meeting.
Those are the questions that I think are the critical questions that we should be looking at: privacy, when the abutters are noticed, and and when the appeals can be made, and how many appeals can be made, and how much time that adds to each warrant article. Those, for me, as someone who sat on the subcommittee, those for me are the critical questions that as a town we want answered.
And let me, if I might, let me just follow up to your last point. If you have a contentious situation like we have seen, once the ZBA has ruled in the construct of the bench, you would be able to go to court. Under the PPS version, the building commissioner's decision would be appealed to the ZBA, which would then have 100 days, and then you'd go to court after that. So I think there are two significant steps there in a contentious case. If a case is not contentious, you could have a different outcome, obviously.
Thank you. Dennis, I'll let somebody else ask the questions of the PPS warrant article.
Thank you. Alec Lebovitz.
Thanks, Harry. I would be interested in hearing those questions answered by the PPS advocates. I didn't originally sign up to ask them, but I do agree broadly with Catherine's analysis, and I think that would be helpful.
I'm happy to sort of jump in and answer them to the extent I can remember them all. I remember the first one involved privacy and need, the issue of need, and whether you're redesigning the plans and or simply moving the pieces around. Under the PPS version, you're essentially just moving the pieces around. So for instance, under Dick's version that allows all these boards to get into the issue of need, it opens up every hearing to questions like, why do you need that? Why do you need this? Couldn't you get along without that toilet? Whereas in the PPS version, the board is planning board, for instance, would have plans, would show a toilet, would show how long the building is, would show that it needs to, for instance, hold 2 vehicles. But they wouldn't be able to say, well, why do you need that toilet? They would simply say, or be able to decide, well, I think we can redesign this better so that instead of being all but 1 foot from the edge of your property line, we can get it 2 feet back. We can make it a little bit smaller and still have the same components that give you the same amount of access. So I think that's one difference. Let's see. What were some of the others?
I think one was
the
about
notice question. The notice question. Yes, I mean the first notice that's given is given would be given the same as under the Banca version. It would be given for the planning board hearing, and then any other hearings that may happen, such as the Preservation Commission. If they give notice quickly, then they give notice for a significance hearing, or any other hearings would have notice. But the principal one for the purposes of the zoning would be the planning hearing, the planning board hearing. I agree with Dick that yes, we don't get to the ZBA until there is an appeal. I'd also agree with John Buckheit that hopefully 9 out of 10 cases we don't get to the ZBA at all, so that involving them in the first place, as one would under the Banca version, really wouldn't be necessary.
Mark, just in terms of the notice answer, there's also notice at the issuance of the reasonable accommodation by the building commissioner, and that includes sending to the abutters the references on what their appeals rights are.
Correct.
Great. Okay, so it sounds like under both proposals, we wouldn't run into a scenario where there would be some major renovation or construction that gets underway without some advance notice to abutters. So I think that addresses one of the key concerns we've heard this evening. This is a tough balance to strike, and I just want to, I think, echo a lot of people's sentiments and how grateful we are to the PPS group, to Dick Banca, to the whole subcommittee for the inordinate amount of work that's gone into this. I think at this point, I'm likely leaning towards the PPS proposal. I think that has struck a better balance from my perspective. I do want to just say I'm not very comfortable with the notion of us referring this article at this point. I'm really, it's quite disheartening to read the experience that the petitioner of the original warrant article went through. And it's really disheartening to now know that our lack of a written policy or bylaw being in place contributed greatly to that hardship and that negative experience. And I not only worry about the remedy in this case, but I'm sure there will be other cases that will arise in any amount of time that we have to wait for further development. And, you know, while we may need to return to this in the future to make tweaks or to fine tune a proposal, I think it's important that some action be taken on this in short order. And I think Neil Gordon outlined a compelling case again earlier against a referral that rang true to me. I did also want to make one small suggestion about the language in subsection 5 of both the Banca proposal and the PPS proposal, which is in bullet B of subsection 5. Both, I believe, read the same about the conclusion of the interactive process. The building commissioner shall grant with modification or deny the request for reasonable accommodation. And there's then a set time period after which automatic approval would be granted. I'm wondering if it would make sense to amend that language to read the building commissioner or their agent shall grant with modification or deny the request. Given that in a situation where the building director, for a variety of reasons or unforeseen circumstances, could be on extended leave, there would then be no official person to issue the ruling on behalf of the town, and we would then default to a position of automatically granting any request filed under that either 45 or 60-day time window under the varying proposals. So
John, do you have any comment on that, and whether there are other provisions that have similar problems in our existing bylaws?
I mean, I think probably as a practical matter, you could go ahead and, I mean, if he was in fact incapacitated, that there would be someone acting. I think that would probably, that person likely would similarly have, have the capacity or have the ability to go ahead and do it under the language. But I think, as Alex suggests, it's a little cleaner. I'm not aware of other bylaws that might have that kind of language, but there may be. I haven't looked at that. It's a good catch, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fran Perler.
So I have a couple of questions, and I find it unfortunate that Sarah Kaplan isn't here. My memory may not be correct, but I believe that she has said in the past, either to this committee or the select board, that abutters have no say in whether an ADA compliant project is being done or not. And I wondered if people would comment or if they remember better than I do about that. And my second question is for Lee or Dick. When I look at that handful of committees that and commissions that you suggest might be involved in making this decision, and yet you say it's going to be done in 45 days. Can you explain to me how you think that would work?
So a lot of that stuff's done in parallel, for one thing. It's not sequentially. In other words, if the issue involves preservation, it goes there concurrently. If it involves conservation, it goes there concurrently. According to Marcus's comment, he suggests that that would occur under the PPS as well. So I don't, there's nothing unique here. In other words, we're not imposing a requirement that doesn't otherwise exist. And if Marcus is correct that those same requirements would apply under PPS, then I don't see it would make any difference.
Okay. And does anyone else remember Sarah Kaplan saying that the abutters are irrelevant for an ADA compliant requirement?
I certainly recall something along those lines, yes. I don't agree with it, but that's what she said.
It's the law.
Well, I don't think, I mean, Dick can perhaps comment on that, but her interpretation of the law does not comport with others.
Yeah, I would, Fran, I would note that both versions have in them, in section 12, building commissioner, in their case, building commissioner boards or commissions in the Benka case, as 12B, measures to issues that can be considered, including measures to reduce the impact on surrounding uses, such as measures that do not constitute an unreasonable financial burden. There is a effort to look at reducing impacts on abutters under both.
But Fran, I would not disagree with you. You can have a process where the abutters are not part of it, as Somerville does. But you can also have a process where abutters are part of it, I believe. And so, yeah.
Okay, and then finally, regarding Alex's comment about agent, it might behoove us to have that kind of language, because if Dick Bennett retires, the town has been having many divisions, departments, et cetera, without directors for a very long time, because of the difficulty in hiring. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Neil Gordon.
Yeah, thank you, Harry. I've saved up what's essentially a series of two fingers that I didn't two finger. Let me start sort of way back. Twice mentioned that oh my goodness, the commissioner might be, you know, a member of the trades, as has been in the past. I'll suggest that if this bylaw is because if this proposal in any form becomes a bylaw, that the town administrator and the select board will do a better job than just to hire a member of the trades. This will become part of the job description. And the ability to make decisions of this type by the building commissioner should have to be considered as part of the job. You just don't hire somebody because they know the electrical code, sort of. So that's, I check that off my list. Secondly, I'm a bit, maybe I heard this wrong, Dick, but I'm a bit disappointed that CTO&S reaches the conclusion to recommend referral, sort of due to a lack of time to fully understand all of the moving parts, and granted that a good number of the parts are in draft form. I think the right response then is to make no recommendation, not a recommendation of referral. If you can't be sure, and maybe, as I said, I may have misheard you, but if you can't be sure what the right decision is, then you make no recommendation. Next, to Lee's notion of social contract, surely, and that's in the ordinary course of, you know, neighbor v. neighbor and neighborhood v. neighborhood, and, you know, the town more broadly, that you give up certain rights to do with your property, in exchange for which your neighbor gives up the same rights for a greater social benefit. I think that there's a different social contract when there is a member of the community who is disabled, and that you have a totally different balance. And I reached the conclusion that the abutters have no rights. And that's a reasonable, from my point of view, that's a reasonable social contract to me. I hear, you know, over and over in Lee's comments that, you know, it's focused, this focus is almost entirely on the person with the disability, and the person with the disability has rights, and it's always followed with a but. And when it's followed by a but, that's dilutive of the right. And I have an issue with that. I ask a different critical question from Catherine Florio's critical question. And my critical question is, when does the person with the disability get to fully live in their home? You know, how long is this process until they get to fully live in their home? You know, I heard tough balance. It's actually an easy balance. You don't balance the abutter's rights, which I suggest round to zero, with the rights of the person with the disability. And the last one, and I've heard many times in the course of not just this evening, that this is not ready for prime time. I'll tell you who's ready for prime time. Someone who's been waiting 5 years and is disabled and needs relief and needs help. And that person is really ready for prime time and has been for 5 years. I'm sort of disappointed with the notion of trying to find a balance that I believe just as unfair to the person most in need here, a member of our community. Thank you.
And
I
Neil,
just want to
as-
say something, Harry, because
as one
I
of
want
the
to.
people, wait a minute. As one of the people who made two of the comments, Neil, that you just so struck down, I think it's terribly unfair on your part too. I think there are balances, and for you to disregard the balances of everybody else, I think is just wrong.
So with all due respect, Harry, I can move the needle from my point of view, in my opinion, in the same way that anybody else on this committee can put that needle in a different place. I didn't say you didn't have a right to your opinion. It is my opinion, and that's all I expressed was my opinion. I don't express that as
That's all I
No,
was
wait a minute,
expressing
Neil,
was
you
my
represented what
Whoa.
I said, or you
I
said
did
something,
not.
and
I
I
did not.
opened the
I did
very
not.
first question
I
I
did
asked.
not. I'll give
The
you my
very
exact words.
first question I asked
No.
was about getting the person back into their house. Very first question I asked. I said, what do we do if it's an emergency and this person needs to get into their house? That was the first question I asked. I would
With all due
appreciate it, Neil,
respect,
that if
all I
you
said was-
cannot represent what it is that I say, that you leave my name out of your
Watch the
comments.
tape. You asked a critical question.
The very
which is not-
first question I asked was, what happens if it is an emergency
I
and
wasn't
this person
responding to
needs to
that.
get back into their house? And
wasn't responding to
apparently
that.
you weren't
I wasn't
listening.
responding to that.
It was the first question I asked.
You asked what you described, and I quote, as a critical question, followed by a question, which was not that question, was a different question. And I made that note then, right, for a reason. And all I said was, I ask a different critical question. Thank you.
One reason that I didn't follow up is because I know that neither of those warrant articles address that situation.
So there are, just to conclude, there are three versions here under consideration. There are the two that we've discussed at length, which each involves some different level of public process. And there is the warrant article and a motion that can be offered under that warrant article as printed in the warrant. And don't be shocked if that motion is not moved by somebody. We haven't discussed that in terms of its relative value versus the others in any meaningful way this evening.
David Pollock.
Thank you. I'll try to keep this very high level, and I'll try to keep it brief. I will note that section 11, and it may also be section 11 in Dick's version, is called emergency accommodations. It's called emergency requests, and I think it addresses emergency requests. It says that there'll be a quick response and a very quick reasonable accommodation granted in those circumstances. And then it does say that,
if go ahead, David.
just in those, yeah, Dick, respectfully, I think we gotta not get into the details. I don't think
all I wanted to say is I think both versions have the identical language.
Right. So that's, I believe that's covered. Anyway, I want to pick up where Neil Gordon left off the first time, and to some extent where he left off the second time, and give you my my recommendation and my assessment. I do want to just make one comment that I just can't not make about Lee saying that their version is the compromise, because it's not. We've got two ends of a spectrum here. And what Mark and I have been trying to do is to really listen to all the voices and to provide something that is helpful all around, again, being very, very oriented towards the needs of the person with a disability, and that this is, we are making civil rights law, and that we really want the town to lead here. To Neil's point, I've never been counting votes to get the 2/3 at town meeting, either literally or figuratively in doing this. What I've been trying to do is to create civil rights law that also understands that a good outcome and a successful outcome, to what John Buckheit said, to avoid lawsuits, may very well be supported by allowing early notice to abutters and a forum for a butter voice, and that could, in certain circumstances, and potentially in the past case, have led to the reasonable accommodation of being successfully constructed long ago, if there had just been more opportunity for people to come together in a process that wasn't completely hidden, and then surprise, the backhoe show up and stuff like that. So it's not about finding, middle ground per se. It's really about crafting the best law. So to the concern that some people have said about that this hasn't been carefully enough considered, that's not true. The staff went through this process and created a process and lived it. Then the ad hoc process, and they really learned from that. Then staff developed a whole detailed process as a policy, and they presented it to the MOD for comment back in January. And then the petitioner's version, they hired very good lawyers and have drafted they drafted a bylaw that I think is legal, and while does not include public involvement or notice or public meetings, I think would be a successful process for something that is almost never encountered. This does not happen every year, and we need to have solved this. And then, Dick's put an enormous amount of legal effort into it and has consulted, reviewed his version with John Buckheit and then Mark and John. Anyway, I think there's been adequate care taken with these drafts, unlike a lot of warrant articles come to us. And to Dennis's question about preference, my preference is that town meeting pass a bylaw, because so much effort has gone into this, and that we need to have this fixed, and we need to, I would really like to see Brookline lead in this arena and show the Commonwealth that we are responsive and thoughtful. And I think that I would support, I urge you to support the version that I'm supporting, but I would, if it came to a vote on the floor of town meeting on the petitioner's motion, and I'll note that the petitioner said they would be willing to amend it to include planning staff, that they just hadn't really thought through that. That was at our very first subcommittee meeting. But I would vote on the floor of town meeting. As a town meeting member, I would vote in support of that article, because I think we need this bylaw. And I think, as Neil Gordon said, I could certainly live with one that was like that. And I think that we need to really deal with the needs of persons with disabilities first in this case. But I do think that having the planning board involved, particularly as much, I think that the abutter notice and the abutter ability to speak at the planning board is very helpful. But I think having the planning board's expertise help to craft the best solution is really a positive innovation that makes our version stand out as better than the petitioner's original version. And then, frankly, I think the Benka version in just raises significant, because it is so always answering the question to favor the traditional process, and to I think to a large extent favor the abutters. I actually think that with our Attorney General, not just the Attorney General, but our Attorney General, Andrea Campbell, and with what I've heard about feedback from the MOD, I actually think that in terms of the bylaw standing, that the Benka version is the risky version. And in terms of being either cut up with a scissors by the Attorney General or, whatever. So I urge you all to to support one of the three, and both tonight and at town meeting.
Thank you. Chris Westfall.
I always tell my students that I use myself as an example because I think that's fair game. I'm now having trouble with stairs. I expect that trouble to get worse over time. I have three choices. I can live on the first floor of my house. I could put an elevator in my back stairwell and eliminate the back stairs fairly easily, but it would be expensive and silly because the house is bigger than I need. Or I could put an elevator on the front or the back of my house as an addition. What's a reasonable accommodation? And really what we're talking about here is how do we put a process in place that has some judgment about what a reasonable accommodation means when we're limited? I think this is very important. I personally will move referral on this if somebody doesn't move referral, because I don't think that we're going to get it right by just picking one of three choices, none of which we think is good enough. And the reality is, while there are not a lot of people who are going to be affected immediately, the town's population is aging. And, you know, I look at this room and we're all getting older, and that will lead to limitations. So you know, as much as I think everybody's worked hard on these, none of them's perfect. We're all admitting that none of them is perfect. And I think at that point, somebody needs to sit down and think it through. You need to involve abutters. It's not fair to declare that I should be able to put an elevator on the outside of my house as a reasonable accommodation without at least some consultation or notice to my neighbors that that's about to happen. And it might not be a reasonable accommodation. Reasonable is in the eye of the beholder very often. That's my only comment on this.
Thank you. I think I was 37 when the night started. Marcus.
Is this summing up?
Well,
ideally.
Yeah, I'm happy. I'm happy. I had just one, you know, basically two things, sort of two finger things. One is this notion of striking the right balance. The law really has already struck the balance for us. The law says that the town can only deny a reasonable accommodation to its zoning requirements if it's an undue burden or expense to the town, or it fundamentally alters the nature of the zoning program or other program. Those are the two.
What does that mean?
Those are the two big ones. I've described. We already know that. We've answered that in subcommittee. I'm not going to open that can of worms right now. But those are the only two things. The other minor thing is whether it's a direct threat to the public. So that's something else that was added to added to our version by John Buckheit at the advice of the MOD. And that's it. Of course, if the person isn't disabled or if they simply don't have a need, those are other reasons to deny it. But in terms of, you know, striking the balance, those are the factors. Those factors say nothing about, you know, whether or not the accommodation should have wisteria planted so it looks more attractive to the neighbors or anything else like that. Okay. It doesn't really say that. Now we can potentially offer that and see what happens, but that's what the balance is. And second, in response to the building commissioner as tradesman, yeah, we got a great building commissioner in Dan Bennett. And if we get some, you know, I don't want to be disparaging, but, you know, some guy who's just a plumber and he makes a mistake in making this decision, first he's going to decide the disability question with the ADA coordinator. And so, or she will decide the thing with the disability coordinator to decide whether the person's disabled and whether there's a need for it. And if that person, the building commissioner, new building commissioner, makes a mistake, it can be appealed to the ZBA, and the ZBA can say, no, you screwed up. Okay, this person, you're not concentrating all the power in one person's hand, as somebody I think said, because there is the right of appeal. Those are just my last points, and I just would heartily second what David said about striking the right balance.
Thank you. Dennis. Oh, sorry. Linda.
Thank you. I know everybody's tired, but we've just heard from the proponents of one side, so I feel like there needs to be some balance. I just want to remind people again, and Marcus just told us again about this again, that one of the questions is the accommodation reasonable? And making that determination based on, you know, the financial aspects to the town and the whether or not the accommodation completely upends the purpose of the zoning bylaw. And the people who should decide those questions are obviously the ZBA, not the building commissioner, because these are three trained individuals to weigh questions of zoning and the impact that, you know, deviating from that, those bylaws will make. They're and the ZBA member told David Pollock that they should be, they're prepared, they're capable, they're willing, they think it's appropriate for them to make this decision. I think this is really important piece of this, and that is the piece that needs to go at a bare minimum to the ZBA. So, and in terms of the balance, you know, I come down on the side of not having any input is, you know, other than the planning board in a private session after their hearing, it is not sufficient. It's just, it's not adequate notice. It's not adequate ability to have input, and nobody is trying to deny any rights of the disabled individuals. And I really think it's disingenuous for people to suggest that that is what people are trying to do here, because no one is trying to do that. So I would urge support for the Selwyn Banka version if we are going to vote in favor of any of the versions. Thank you.
Thank you. Dennis.
So I think that because we heard from David and Marcus, if there was any last remarks that Dick wanted to make this the opportunity, although I would urge you keep them brief.
Thank you. I think we have beaten to death, and you all have the basis to make the decision about who should be deciding these questions. Should it be the building commissioner? Should it be the zoning board of appeals? And I've expressed the reason why I believe it should be the zoning board of appeals. I've outlined and I highlighted the reasons for that. I've done it in the memorandum, and I've done it orally during my opening comments. I would also add that, and I'm not going to flog this to death at this point, but the memorandum that I submitted, I hope most of you, at least, hopefully all of you, have had a chance to look at it. But on pages 6 to 7, 6 to 8 of that memorandum, at the end of that memorandum, I've identified a number of situations where the PPS version does not follow the language that is actually included in the Massachusetts Office on Disability guidance. And that discrepancy is something that I think has to be considered. I would be very concerned about a wholesale adoption of a proposal that actually varies from the language. What I've tried to do is to follow the language as closely as possible with respect to dealing with alternatives, dealing with an examination of needs, dealing with confidentiality, dealing with the basic purpose of the zoning bylaw, not undermining that. And I would hope that the language that has been utilized in my draft would be language that would be incorporated. I also obviously feel strongly that the appropriate body here, given the legal issues that have to be decided at the end of this process, is appropriately the ZBA. So I will leave it at that, and thank you.
Thank you very much. So I've spoken to the moderator to talk about reasonable approaches to get as comprehensive a set of votes on the table as possible, and since having heard that there will be a referral motion offered, and given that that would take precedence, I'm going to operate under the assumption that there will be a referral motion that we will vote on, and I'm operating under the assumption that that motion will be identical to the one that CTO&S voted. So that we would take that.
Can we get a clarification on that? Because my understanding that CTO&S was referring the bank of version.
No.
Referral?
No,
Did that not happen?
No, but before we go into the clarifications, can I outline the process and then we can go into the details of the motions? Thank you. The process will be to vote on the referral motion, and if a referral motion passes, we are done with warrant article 14 and we'll move on to warrant article 15. If it fails, then what we should do is place on the table the petitioner's motion, and then I'm arbitrarily choosing we will take the Benka motion as a substitute, amend by substitution, take the PPS motion to amend by substitution. Eventually, at the end of that process, we will come up with a motion that we can vote up or down. And if we vote up, great. And if we vote down, then we can consider taking another, having a reconsideration. We'll either have a recommendation of no action, or we could reconsider for a motion, another motion to refer. Dick, if I can bring up the language of the CTO&S motion, because it was sent to me earlier today. But if you want to explain it while I'm doing that.
It was not, there was one member who wanted to refer, maybe more, but it was a balanced refer the subject matter of warrant article 14.
Yeah, here we are. Voted to refer the subject matter of warrant article 14 to the select board for the expeditious creation of a bylaw or of policies and procedures for resolving reasonable accommodation claims under fair housing and disability law, ensuring compliance with federal and state law while preserving public process and the rights of abutters and the public, the privacy rights of applicants and the roles of the planning board, zoning board of appeals, and other boards and commissions. The creation of such policy and procedure should involve at least the building commissioner's office, the ADA coordinator, town council's office, representatives of boards and commissions, and the regulatory planning office within the Department of Planning and Community Development. And the select board voted to refer both articles. I don't have the precise language that they voted. It's probably not identical to that language, but it was a referral back to the select board.
But it was several weeks ago, and they have it on their
Yes.
agenda tomorrow night.
Yeah. I'm just, that's why I was proposing that if we were going to take a referral motion, we would start with the CTOS one, because that's more recent. We're not under an obligation to pass it, of course, just to feel like a reasonable starting point. So with that in mind, I'm assuming, Christine, since you volunteered, you're going to make
Yeah,
that
I'll move
motion.
the CTNO motion to refer.
Second.
I'm just going to put in a placeholder which says CTOS referral language, and we'll paste it in because we just read it.
Yeah.
All right. So if this passes, then our recommendation is to refer. We'll have a very nuanced report for town meeting. If this fails, we'll go on to other votes and have a differently nuanced report for town meeting. Share screen. Okay, so we're voting now on whether we're going to recommend referral of the subject matter of warrant article 14 as per the CTO&S language. Michael Berger.
Yes, to refer.
Ben Birnbaum.
Yes.
Harry's not here. Cliff.
No.
Anthony.
I think he had to go.
Oh, right. He had to leave. Sorry. John.
Yes.
Catherine.
Yes.
Harry.
Yes.
David Mark.
Right. Could you come back to me?
Sure. Neil.
No.
Susan.
Yes.
Perry.
No.
Kelly.
No.
Elisa.
Sorry. Yes. Yes.
Okay. Janice.
No.
Alec.
No.
Carol.
Yes.
Jocelyn.
Yes.
Donnell.
Donnell had to leave.
Okay. Mark. I'm sorry, Linda.
Yes.
Mark.
No.
Fran.
No.
David.
No.
Lee.
Yes.
Christine.
Yes.
And who did I skip over?
I'll vote
David
yes.
Mark.
I'll vote yes.
Still vote yes. All right. So by a vote of 13 to 9 to 0, our recommendation mirrors CTO&S's language. So that gives us 5 fewer votes, as it turns out. Well, thank you to everyone. I know there's a ton of work that went into this, and this is just the first step in this discussion, and I anticipate a pretty lengthy debate at town meeting as well.
I think that, I don't know who's going to write the combined report on this. And
yeah, let's take that. Can we take that offline? I realize there's going to be a problem with figuring out how the combined report is going to be written, and it has to be submitted by Wednesday. So we're going to have to start with a lot of the materials that you put together, but I'll follow up with you either later tonight or first thing in the morning, you and David and other members of the subcommittee and Harry. We need to go on to warrant article 15. If those of you who will remember that Marcus presented warrant article 15 and the subcommittee's recommendation for favorable action, it'd be a good opportunity now to propose questions or comments from the full committee. And I'm not looking at the screen, so I don't know if anybody's putting their name in the chat.
Nobody. Yes, Linda Olsen-Pelkey.
Thanks. I am under the impression that the version we're discussing tonight of Article 15 was amended by the Preservation Commission. So whatever it is that we voted on the subcommittee seems somewhat irrelevant.
It was only modestly amended. They just added that the chair and another member would consult after everything else. I don't think there was
Well,
another.
there was a lot of red type
That
on
was all voted
version.
by, that was all Tina's original version that was presented to CTO&S. Excuse me, to Preservation Commission when they met on Tuesday, a week ago, last Tuesday. And they liked it, but they wanted to strengthen it by having personal representation follow their determination of significance. So it's
Do you-
substantially
to
like
this
what we
to this
voted.
point, David, do you have a red line between what the subcommittee voted and what the new motion is by any chance?
I
I
thought
can
that
say,
I thought that it went in the packet. Tina McCarthy provided it to Lisa.
Okay.
but not, there's not a red line between what the committee voted on, what our subcommittee voted on, and what preservation just voted on, because they sent us a PDF and it was just like the last moment. But the only difference was that the version we voted on had the internal administrative process where the Tina, or the preservation planner, would get together with the chair of the preservation commission and a technical expert. And the change is that the technical expert has been designated as another member of the commission. That's the only change. They accepted the changes that our subcommittee made in terms of not requiring the applicant to file a second application or a separate application for the preservation committee for the demolition permit. Yeah, it's really, really minor. So there's really nothing substantive.
Okay, can I ask another question?
Sure.
So what happens when there is a zoning change and the demolition bylaw gets triggered? What happens when the two things have to work together?
Say that again.
Well, I mean, all the Preservation Commission is looking at is whether the building is significant or not that's being altered for the accommodation, correct? Then they're going to be involved in the interactive process with certain subgroup of people from the Preservation Commission and the staff, etc. But what happens? Is there going to be a separate concurrent process when it also involves, a significant zoning alteration? And how do these two things work
The
together?
significant zoning alteration is not within the jurisdiction of the Preservation Commission. That's within.
Right, so these are two separate processes that will be going on concurrently, correct?
Yes, that's the whole idea of both Dick's version and the PPS version.
There's not two
separate- and
different
then-
versions of 15 though.
No, but the 15 just concerns the demolition delay bylaw. It doesn't concern anything else.
I don't know, it just seems like there's some consideration on how they're gonna work together timing wise, if nothing else, but it's not something I've figured out. I think it's a question. It's kind of like Carol Levin's question about the condos. It's just, it just has not been contemplated.
Well, it was contemplated in that Tina said that at least with respect to local historic districts, the two processes are completely different.
Right.
So we're not considering anything regarding local historic districts when we consider this demolition delay bylaw.
Right.
So if you're concerned about demolition of local historic in a local historic district,
I'm not.
Okay. And I just want to point out that Jocelyn kindly put the paragraph from the Preservation Commission's report explicitly saying what the additional change was, which seems to mirror what I said earlier.
Right, Linda,
Well, I mean, I just think that this one has not been adequately vetted. So, you know, I think we contemplated it a little bit. We all were kind of waiting to see what the Preservation Commission did. I mean, part of me thinks if they're happy with it, then we should be happy with it. But honestly, I don't think we've really thought this one through either. So I feel conflicted.
right. David Mark.
David Mark, yeah.
Thanks. Just a very brief question. And I know it's very late. Is there anything regarding 15's relation to 14 where we need to either pass them both or not pass either? Are there any loopholes that would be created? Any contradictions if we pass 15 but not 14 or vice versa? I'm just wondering if there's any, what the connection is to each other.
John, do you have
Yeah, let's hear from staff.
Sure, yeah, no, so I think 14 references the demo delay bylaw, but I think at CTO&S we concluded that this could stand on its own. I can tell you that warrant article 14, provides 45 days as a general time limit for all boards and commissions to get back to the building commissioner, or the PPS version, and obviously, and so that would apply in this case, although I think this independently doesn't have a specific time frame, but I do think it could still stand on its own.
What about the appeal process and the appeal times on 15? If somebody wants to appeal a decision of 15?
Yeah, that's a good question. It would have to be a sort of a mandamus action. There's kind of a catch-all that allows you to appeal a municipal official's decision, and it might have to be in Superior Court, something. If for example, the demo delay was waived and someone wanted to appeal that, I can't remember the statute, but I think you'd have to utilize that process.
Okay, so it just sounds to me like we need to refer this one to so we can get it right the first time. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to point out, well, Dick's version doesn't have any language about the appeal, so you don't necessarily have to specify. I mean, people have attorneys and they kind of understand their rights, and so you don't really have to define at each moment when what the appeal right is. And some would argue that in some cases it's not appropriate in a bylaw. So,
Jocelyn?
Thank you, Harry. So doesn't Article 15 presume passage of Article 14 where it refers to necessary accommodations as determined by the building commissioner and the ADA coordinator? And so forth?
Not necessarily, because that's how the process, I mean, if we're still operating under an ad hoc process, as we did in the past, then if the building commission, where the building commissioner did grant the accommodation, then, there'd still be the issue with the accommodation. I mean, let me back up. It is late. So what happened, and John can describe it even better probably, but what happened in the past was that the accommodation was granted, the Preservation Commission put a stay of demolition, a demolition stay on the project. It went on for about 6 months. It wasn't achieving anything, and John had to intervene and tell the Preservation Commission, you can't do this because you're running the risk of generating litigation against you for a delay that's really serving no purpose. And then the Preservation Commission got together and voted to lift its stay at that point. Is that fair to say, John?
yes.
But this assumes a process then. And, right?
I mean,
It assumes a process where the building commissioner, along with the ADA coordinator, will determine necessary accommodation. So I think it would be awkward to adopt this where the former has been referred. To me, it seems awkward. I'm also, I will add, I'm in the camp that believes the ZBA should, as a fact-finding body, should be making the determination, but in any event, it seems awkward to me that this process seems to be established in these subsections 4 and 5.
That,
Well, I want to just, but
Do you want me to comment?
yeah,
Sure, yeah. So yeah, no, I agree. The specificity of saying, because I suppose that somebody other than the 8A coordinator and building commissioner possibly could decide, but I think it's unlikely. I think, the ad hoc process we came up with and the issue came up in front of in the former case before the Board of Appeals as to who was the proper entity to issue a reasonable accommodation. And I think we did resolve that the building commissioner was probably, for under zoning, would be the best person. So it's, federal law does require that you move forward regardless of whether you have a formal written process in place. So certainly if we had an application, we'd have to move forward with it. So that much is certain.
Got it, but John, wouldn't this have to be amended? Assuming that this is assuming Article 14 is referred, and whatever body that's referred to comes up with a new bylaw, this might have to be referred as well, or adjusted as well, correct?
I think it could be, depending on what the town comes up with. If this is referred and there's something new that's come up with, that there might have to be some changes to the language, but
I
think
that just strikes me as being awkward. That's
yeah,
just, thank
yeah.
you.
CTO&S voted it. We talked about this a bit at the meeting, maybe not in this depth, but I think we landed on that it could still exist independently. But
So how did they vote?
Awkwardly.
they voted in favor. Was it? I can't remember the vote. Dick, do you remember?
But it was the old version. It was before preservation.
No, this was,
No, I believe the vote was unanimous, with one abstention, if I recall correctly. It may have been one negative vote, but it was either 601 or 511. But we did not discuss, quite candidly, it happened at the end of the evening, and we didn't discuss the interplay with Article 14.
So I would be inclined to move referral of this as well.
Okay, when we get there,
Yeah.
which might be now if there's nobody
yeah,
else signed up.
Dennis, there's nobody signed up. I think we're ready for motions.
All right. So I assume someone's going to be moving favorable action on the motion as amended by the planning commission, but we'll take Jocelyn's motion for referral. Do you have the language, Jocelyn? Do you want me to copy the language from
Yes, that would work nicely, Dennis. Thank you.
hang on one moment.
I'll
So
second.
it would be exactly the same motion we just voted, except that everywhere it says warrant article 14, it would say warrant article 15.
Well, I guess my question is, is it possible to move the Preservation Commission additional language and then refer that?
Yeah.
yeah, that's what we're doing. I mean, the subcommittee can almost do it because we recommended favorable action on something that was almost the final version, but parliamentarily, Marcus could move it as a town meeting, as a AC member. And then
So long as we're referring the version that has the Preservation Commission language incorporated.
Yeah, well, I mean, this was to refer the subject matter of warrant article 14, which would include all of that language, including
15, but yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry, 15. Yeah. I'm misleading. I'm sorry.
Can we make the motion to refer conditional on warrant article 14 failing?
Really, no.
Well, what if it passes? We
Well,
look
then-
pretty silly.
No. I mean, we can adopt this later. It doesn't really matter.
It seems to me that town meeting, if they pass 14, will pass 15 and vice versa.
Yeah,
That seems to just, I'm with Marcus, so if we recommend referral, and that's all we say, then we've recommended referral. That, I don't think informs town meeting, should referral on 14 be defeated? And why can't we
Yeah,
follow
we
the,
can have two motions, I
timeline?
guess, which is basically what our recommendation is if warrant article 14 passes and what our recommendation is if warrant article 14 fails.
But Dennis, we have multiple versions of 14.
That's the problem.
We'd
That's
have
the
multiple
problem.
versions of what we are in favor of or not. So that's a can of worms we can't do at 10:30 at night.
I
No.
think it makes sense to just
Yeah, there's the inconsistency that Jocelyn pointed
So
out.
I'm gonna suggest that, again, town meeting is entitled to be informed that if the motion to refer on 14 fails, then we can have no recommendation on 15. But to leave it as a recommendation to refer 15, because we think that 14 will be referred also,
Except that CTO&S is under the belief that it can stand independently. Which I disagree.
And we are, and if our referral motion were to pass, we would be implicitly saying that we don't believe it would stand independently. That's what you're saying, right, Jocelyn?
Yes.
Yeah,
We can always revisit this later if we need to, but let's just vote it now.
yeah, well, I'm inclined to take the referral motion and vote on it and see what happens, and then we can potentially have another motion for, you know, a contingent recommendation of some sort, such as no recommendation or the like. So we have a Murphy motion, which is refer subject matter of warrant article 14.
15.
Using 15. Thank you. Using identical language to warrant article 14's referral.
I just want to
motion.
point out that all three versions have the same reference to Article 914.5B. So so it really would matter because that's what sort of, I think, creates the confusion. And the only reference to Article 14 is the 914.5B is amended. So, you know.
Can you translate that into non-lawyer English for those of us who are?
Yeah. Well, so the
challenged.
Yeah, no, it's late. So the Article 15 as amended that I have up on my screen here says the building commissioner forwards a copy of the application to the Preservation Commission as described in section 9.14.5.b of the town zoning bylaw as amended. That's the only reference to what's happened under warrant article 14. The beginning of the article simply references internally to the demolition delay bylaw, and other references are also just internal to the demolition delay bylaw. So the only way that their only confusion is created if nothing from 14 passes is that you've passed a warrant article 15 that references something that hasn't passed. But if warrant article passes in any of the forms that are currently suggested, 1A, B, or C, they all include this paragraph 914.5.b as amended.
So you're saying
does that language even required though? Because if 14 passed, then wouldn't it be referred as? Wouldn't it be required to be referred? Or maybe I'm confused by the by what's being asked in Article 15.
Well, because but the Article 15 just references Article 14 in having the building commissioner forwarding a copy of the application to the Preservation Commission as described in section 914.
Well, I was just saying that if the as described line were struck, would it change the requirements under 15 at all, and would it remove the ambiguity?
Well, that's another solution, correct?
I
That would
think
work
to
as well.
Charleston's point was that would it be the building commissioner who'd be doing this, and that's not, you know.
Oh, thank you.
I think
Right.
it probably would
Thank
be,
you.
as I said here.
I was referring to subsections 4 and 5, Marcus, referring to the building commissioner.
4 and 5. Oh, Roman numeral.
Yes.
Ah, I see. Okay.
All right. All right. I'm gonna consider that we are going to vote on this referral motion. It will either pass or fail. And if it passes, we do have a subcommittee report that will become the basis for a good portion of our description to town meeting, even if our recommendation is for referral. Share screen. So on the table, and did someone second your motion, Jocelyn?
I don't think so.
I'll second it.
I did.
Thank you. Thank you. So the question is whether we're going to recommend referral of the subject matter of warrant article 15 as we did for warrant article 14. Michael. He's not here. Ben.
Yes.
Cliff.
Abstain.
John.
Yes.
Catherine. Did she leave?
I think
I think she did.
think she
Harry
left.
F.
Yes.
David Mark.
Yes.
Neil.
Abstain.
Susan.
Yes.
Perry.
You come back to me.
Sure. Kelly. I think Kelly left.
No, I'm
No,
still here.
Oh, you're still here? What'd you say, Kelly?
I'm sorry, abstain?
Okay. Elisa.
Yes.
Janice.
Yes.
Alec.
Abstain.
Carol.
Yes.
Jocelyn.
Yes.
Linda.
Yes.
Mark.
Abstain.
Fran.
Yes.
David.
No.
Lee.
Yes.
Chris.
Abstain.
And who did I skip over?
Harry.
Yeah.
Perry.
How about no?
No. Okay. So 12 in favor, 2 opposed, 6 abstentions. We're going to recommend referral of warrant article 15. I will follow up with the subcommittee, like I said, to figure out how we write these reports and who's going to speak at town meeting. Is that the end of the business tonight, Harry? I think it
Yes.
is.
Yes, it is.
You want to announce what we're doing on Thursday?
On Thursday, we're meeting at 7 o'clock, so we're back to our Thursday schedule. We will be doing a public hearing on 2 collective bargaining agreements, which are relatively simple and were like the collective bargaining agreement we passed a couple weeks ago. And then we're doing some mop-up work. There's a appropriation transfer for the IT department, a possible reconsideration of WA25 on the climate change super fund. I'm not quite sure why, but something came up with that. And then a possible vote on warrant article 30. Right, warrant article 30, the Moderators Committee on Form of Government, we had tabled that. And so now it will be coming back.
Great. Thanks, everyone. See you on Thursday. And thanks to everyone for getting in combined reports, including the most recent updates that are going to go out in the in the supplement. I've gotten so far, I think, fairly good feedback from those who have reached out. So good work, everyone.
Good night.
See you on Thursday.